Hi guys and welcome to Boring History Relaxing. Tonight we step into a world where the sky has decided to close itself, where snow falls so thick and steady that it erases distance, softens sound and presses gently but persistently against the roof of the earth itself. You stand on an open stretch of prairie wind, tugging at your coat, flakes landing on your eyelashes before you can blink them away. The horizon is already dissolving into white. The dugout shelter waits a few steps ahead, little more than a door cut into a rise of frozen soil. You hesitate, listening to the wind growl across the flat land. You probably will not survive this if you insist on modern comforts and central heating. The storm does not care about your preferences. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while the snow piles higher, tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what your local time is right now. I love imagining this quiet community scattered across time zones. Now dim the lights and step forward with me as you pull the rough wooden door open and slip into the earth. Inside, the temperature shifts immediately. It is not warm exactly, but it is steadier. The wind's howl dulls into a distant, muffled hum. The walls are packed soil, reinforced with timber beams cut from nearby cottonwoods. A mainstream historical fact worth noting is that thousands of settlers on the 19th century American plains built dugouts like this, because lumber was scarce and expensive while earth was plentiful and insulating. Some families even preferred them to flimsy frame houses during brutal winters. You lower yourself down the narrow steps carved into the packed dirt. Each footfall sends a faint crumble of dry soil to the floor. The ceiling is low enough that you instinctively duck. There is a smell here, rich and mineral, mixed with wood smoke from the small iron stove in the corner. It is not unpleasant. It smells like damp clay after rain, like a cellar that remembers every season it has endured. Outside, the snow thickens. You can sense it in the way the light at the doorway dims from grey to pale blue. The world above is vanishing layer by layer. Storms on the Great Plains were known to drop several feet of snow in a single event, especially during the harsh winters of the late 1800s. Accounts from that era describe blizzards that lasted days, sometimes a full week, with wind strong enough to disorient experienced ranchers within yards of their homes. You set your small bundle down near a bunk made of wooden planks and straw ticking. It looks thin. It probably is. You brush your hand across it anyway, feeling the uneven texture of dried grass beneath rough cloth. Comfort in this place is relative. Survival comes first. The wind slams something outside. Perhaps a loose shutter, perhaps nothing at all. The sound reaches you softened, as if wrapped in wool. Snow has already begun to bank against the exposed front wall of the dugout. Over time, drifts will rise higher than the doorway, transforming this shelter into something that feels less like a house and more like a burrow. A quirky tidbit from period diaries mentions that some settlers jokingly compared their dugouts to fox dens, claiming that at least foxes didn't have to shovel their front doors every morning. The humour was dry, but it helped. When the sky is an endless swirl of white laughter, becomes a small act of defiance. You sit on the bunk and listen more carefully. The storm has a rhythm. Gust pause, gust again. Snow striking the roof makes a faint whispering sound like handfuls of sand tossed gently against canvas. Each impact adds weight above your head. The roof is made of logs laid side by side, covered with brush and then packed earth. That earth will soon be buried under fresh drifts. Historians still argue whether dugouts were truly safer in blizzards than above-ground structures, or whether their perceived safety came mostly from psychological comfort. Structurally, the surrounding soil insulated against wind and cold. Yet there were risks too. Roofs could sag under excessive weight. Walls could seep moisture. In rare cases, poorly reinforced ceilings did collapse. Tonight you choose not to dwell on that possibility. Instead you notice the small details, the way your breath curls in the lamplight, the faint ticking sound from the cooling stovepipe, the gritty texture under your palm as you lean back against the wall. Earth presses close on all sides, but not aggressively. It feels solid, steady. Outside the prairie disappears entirely. There is no more horizon, no more visible fence lines or distant trees. Snowstorms like this were sometimes called whiteouts, a term that still makes sense today. Visibility can drop to nearly zero, and without landmarks, even a short walk becomes dangerous. You imagine stepping out into that spinning whiteness and losing all sense of direction within seconds. The dugout, humble as it is, becomes an anchor in a world that has lost its edges. You stretch your legs and remove your gloves, flexing stiff fingers. The soil wall behind you holds a quiet, muted warmth. Not heat exactly, but a refusal to match the savage cold outside. Earth changes temperature slowly. It absorbs and releases warmth gradually. That patience becomes your ally. The lamp flickers. Shadows ripple across the ceiling beams. You think about the people who first carved this space, shoveling frozen ground with raw hands, hauling logs, packing sod. They worked quickly, often racing the first heavy snows of the season. There is something almost intimate about living inside a shelter shaped by your own labour. Every mark in the wall tells a story of effort. The storm intensifies again. Wind screams briefly, then drops to a low moan. Snow continues to accumulate above, compressing into layers. Soon the dugout will be tucked under a thick blanket of white. Strangely, that thought calms you. Snow is heavy, yes, but it also insulates. It seals cracks. It muffles noise. It transforms the world into something quieter. You lie back slowly on the bunk boots still on coat pulled tight. The ceiling looms a few feet above your face. You can almost feel the snow settling on top grain by grain. Each flake joins thousands of others, forming a soft barrier between you and the chaos beyond. This is only the first storm of the season. There will be others. Repeated snowstorms were common during certain winters on the plains, arriving one after another, with little Thor in between. Diaries speak of weeks where the land remained locked in white silence, broken only by the need to dig outdoors and check livestock. You sense that this night is the beginning of such a stretch. For now, though, you focus on the present moment. The dim lamp, the scent of smoke and damp clay, the muffled fury outside, the way the dugout holds you in its earthen embrace. The sky may be closing, but here beneath it, inside soil and timber, you have carved out a pocket of stillness. You close your eyes briefly, listening to the storm try and fail to reach you fully. The world has narrowed to this small underground room, this low ceiling, this bed of straw. And as the snow continues to fall, you begin to understand that survival here is less about strength and more about patience, but also about yielding to the rhythm of the storm instead of fighting it. The night stretches on and the snow does not stop. Morning does not arrive with sunlight, it arrives with a heavier silence. You wake to the sound of nothing at all, which in a storm can feel louder than wind. The lamp has burned low. The air is cool against your face and your breath rises in a pale cloud before drifting toward the low ceiling. For a moment you forget where you are, then your hand brushes the packed earth wall beside the bunk and memory settles back into place. The dugout is still. The storm has not ended. You can sense its presence in the faint pressure above, in the way the doorway glows with a dim bluish light filtered through layers of snow. The world outside has been rearranged overnight. Inside, though, the room remains stubbornly the same. You sit up slowly, boots scraping against the dirt floor. The space is small enough that every movement feels deliberate. Carving shelter from earth requires intention. A mainstream historical fact is that many dugouts on the American plains were cut directly into hillsides or creek banks, with only one exposed wall facing outward. This design reduced wind exposure and conserved building materials, but it also meant that careful planning was essential. Drainage, roof support and ventilation had to be considered from the very beginning. You imagine the first day of construction. The ground likely frozen at the surface, each shovel strike ringing against frost-hardened soil. Families often work together, sometimes with neighbours, to excavate a rectangular cavity large enough for a single room. The removed earth was not wasted. It was packed over the roof logs to create insulation. Timber beams were laid across the top, sometimes scavenged from rift bottoms miles away. In regions where trees were scarce, even that was a challenge. There is something humbling about living inside a space that once required so much labour. Every wall is a reminder of muscle and time. You run your fingers along a faint groove where a shovel once bit too deep. It feels almost like a signature. A quirky detail found in settler recollections is that some families plastered their dugout walls with newspaper pages when they could get them both to reduce crumbling soil and to add a hint of decoration. Imagine reading yesterday's headlines while snow buries your front door. It must have felt strangely modern and fragile against the raw earth. You stand and cross the room carefully. The stove is cold now, only a faint trace of warmth lingering in the iron. You crouch to stir the ashes, adding a few precious pieces of wood. Fuel is never abundant. Wood might have been hauled from distant groves or traded at cost. On treeless stretches of prairie-dried animal dung was sometimes burned as a substitute. The thought may wrinkle your nose, but practicality often overrules sentiment when temperatures plunge below freezing. Historians still argue whether dugouts were meant to be temporary solutions or long-term homes for many settlers. Some evidence suggests that families planned to replace them with framed houses once resources allowed. Yet other accounts describe people living in dugouts for years, even decades, because they proved unexpectedly durable and warm. The line between temporary and permanent blurred when winter after winter tested the same earthen walls. You push open the inner latch and press gently against the outer door. It resists. Snow is piled high against it. You can feel the weight through the wood. This will be your morning ritual now, clearing the doorway before anything else. You set your shoulder against it and shove harder. The door gives a few inches, then stops again. Snow trickles down in fine powder through the crack, dusting your boots. With a small shovel kept just inside for this purpose, you begin to scoop. Each motion sends a soft cascade of white into the room. The cold air bites at your cheeks as the gap widens. Slowly, patiently, you carve a narrow tunnel through the drift. The snow is lighter than soil, but relentless in volume. It keeps coming. Outside, the landscape is unrecognizable. Fences are swallowed. The prairie grass that once rippled in wind is gone beneath a smooth wind-sculpted surface. The sky remains a flat grey dome. You step out only far enough to gauge the situation. Snow reaches nearly to the roofline. In time, repeated storms will build these drifts higher still, transforming the dugout into something nearly invisible from a distance. There is a strange comfort in that concealment. Snow acts as an extra layer of insulation, sealing cracks and softening drafts. Modern science explains the insulating properties of snow through trapped air pockets that reduce heat transfer. Settlers may not have known the physics, but they understood the effect. A house half buried in snow often stayed warmer than one fully exposed. You retreat back inside, brushing snow from your coat. The air feels almost cozy by comparison. Earth walls do not respond instantly to temperature swings. They hold steady, resisting the wild fluctuations outside. You begin to appreciate this slowness. In a world defined by sudden storms and biting gusts, steadiness feels like luxury. The ceiling beams draw your eye. Each one must bear not only the weight of soil, but now the accumulating snow above it. You picture the logs pressed downward, fibres creaking under strain. Yet properly built dugouts were remarkably strong. The earth itself distributed weight across the structure. Still, caution was always wise. Some families reinforced roofs with additional supports mid-winter if drifts grew too deep. You move about the room, straightening blankets, checking supplies. Flour sacks are tucked into a corner. A small crock of salt rests beside them. Food storage inside a dugout had its own challenges. Moisture could seep through walls if drainage was poor. To combat this, builders often dug shallow trenches around the exterior or lined walls with boards when available. Every improvement required time and resources. As you settle back onto the bunk, you notice the quiet again. The storm has eased slightly, but snow continues to fall in fine, persistent flakes. There is no birdsong, no distant wagon wheels. The world feels paused. You close your eyes briefly and listen to your own breathing. In this earthen room, your senses sharpen. You become aware of the faint crackle from the stove as it warms the subtle shift of packed soil settling under weight. You realize that living here demands attentiveness, not fear but awareness. The dugout is sturdy, yet it asks you to pay attention to its moods. Outside, another gust sweeps across the buried prairie. Snow slides from one drift to another. The cycle has begun. Carving shelter from earth was only the first step. Now you must maintain it, defend it against repetition. Storm after storm will test the same walls, the same beams, the same door you just forced open. And as you sit in the muted glow of lamplight, you begin to understand that survival in repeated snowstorms is not a single dramatic act. It is a series of small, steady efforts. Digging out, reinforcing, lighting the stove again, listening, waiting. The earth around you remains solid and patient. Above the sky continues to give. By the third morning, you stop expecting to see the horizon. You wake and know without even rising from the bunk that the world above has narrowed again. The air feels slightly warmer than the first night, not because the storm has ended, but because the snow has deepened over the roof. It presses down in a quiet, steady way, adding weight and insulation at once. You lie still for a moment and listen. The wind still moves, but its voice has softened. Snow absorbs sound in a way that feels almost intentional, as if the land itself has chosen to whisper. A mainstream historical fact is that many plain settlers reported their dugouts becoming noticeably quieter and warmer once drifts built up against the exposed wall and over the roof. The snow acted like an extra layer of packed wool. What looked threatening from outside often became protective from within. You roll onto your side and reach up to touch the ceiling beam. It is cool but not icy. The logs are thick, laid close together, covered with brush and a dense layer of earth. Now the earth is buried under several feet of fresh snow. You picture it from above, a white mound barely distinguishable from the rest of the drifted prairie. If someone passed by at a distance, they might not realize a family slept beneath that rise. The thought is both comforting and unsettling. Comforting because concealment means shelter. Unsettling because invisibility can feel like erasure. You are here breathing, tending a stove, yet the storm has smoothed the surface of the world until your presence is nearly undetectable. You swing your legs over the side of the bunk. The floor is firm and jay for now. You're grateful for that. Moisture is always a concern in earthen homes. Builders often angled floors slightly toward the doorway so that any water from melting snow would drain outward rather than pool inside. It is a small design choice, but in repeated storms it can mean the difference between a tolerable winter and a miserable one. As you stir the stove back to life, you think about the roof again. Each additional snowfall increases the load above. Historians still argue whether most dugout collapses were caused by poor construction or by extraordinary weather events that exceeded any reasonable expectation. Some claim that well-built shelters rarely failed. Others point to diaries describing sudden cave-ins during especially heavy winters. You glance at the central support post in the middle of the room and feel a flicker of appreciation. Someone thought ahead. A quirky tidbit from prairie lore tells of families climbing onto their snow-covered roofs during lulls in the storm, not to remove snow, but to pack it down deliberately. By compressing loose drifts into denser layers, they reduce the chance of uneven weight distribution. Imagine standing on your own roof, stomping snow into submission, while the wind tugs at your coat. It sounds absurd and entirely practical at the same time. You finish coaxing the fire and hold your hands near the stove. The warmth spreads slowly, seeping into chilled fingers. Earth walls do not radiate heat like brick. Instead, they seem to hold warmth in reserve, releasing it gently. This slow exchange creates a sense of steadiness that you begin to rely on. Outside temperatures may plunge far below freezing. Inside, the difference is not dramatic, but it is enough. You approach the door again, prepared for resistance. This time when you press against it, the wood barely moves. Snow has compacted overnight, turning into a dense barrier. You chip at it carefully with the shovel, carving a narrow vertical shaft of light. Each scoop sends a dull thud as snow falls against the drift outside rather than spilling inward. When the opening is wide enough, you peer out. The landscape is unrecognizable. Snow rises above the doorway, now forcing you to climb upward rather than step outward. The dugout has become a hollow beneath a white hill. Wind sculpts the surface into ripples and ridges like frozen waves. Repeated snowstorms were a defining feature of certain winters during the settlement of the American plains. One blizzard might lay down a heavy base, the next would harden it with wind, a third would add fresh accumulation before any meaningful thaw. Over time, homes, fences, even small barns could disappear from view. Survival depended on memory and careful orientation. You step back inside, quickly sealing the door against the cold. The room feels almost snug compared to the vast whiteness outside. The weight above your head no longer feels threatening. It feels protective. Snow, once feared, now forms an insulating shield between you and the cutting wind. You sit again on the bunk and let your thoughts drift. There is something profoundly intimate about sleeping under layers of earth and snow. You are tucked beneath the storm, not fighting it from the surface, but yielding to its rhythm. The world continues in violent motion above, yet here you remain in relative stillness. You run your fingers along the packed soil wall. Tiny grains crumble under pressure, leaving faint traces on your skin. The scent of earth is stronger today, perhaps stirred by subtle shifts in humidity. Smoke from the stove mingles with that mineral aroma, creating a fragrance that will soon become synonymous with winter in your mind. Years from now, you might catch a similar scent in a garden or cellar and feel transported back to this buried room. The ceiling creaks softly, not loudly enough to alarm you, just a gentle acknowledgement of the weight it carries. You tilt your head and listen more closely. Snow settles, gradually compressing under its own mass. That settling produces faint sighs and pops as the roof adjusts. Each sound reminds you that the storm is not static. It is alive, shifting, reshaping the surface above. You lie back once more, staring at the low beams. It occurs to you that above those logs beyond the earth and snow, the sky continues to release more flakes. The storm has not finished. It may return with renewed intensity tonight. Yet here beneath the drift you feel a curious sense of peace. Sleeping in a dugout during repeated snowstorms is not about conquering winter. It is about adapting to it, allowing layers of soil and snow to become allies rather than enemies. You're not exposed to the open sky. You're held by the land itself. The lamp flickers, gently casting shadows that sway like slow-moving branches. Outside, the wind resumes its distant murmur. Above, snow thickens the blanket. You close your eyes and imagine the dugout from afar, a small pocket of warmth beneath an endless field of white. The storm continues to build its roof over you, and you, sheltered beneath it, begin to trust the weight. The wind returns in the night with a different voice. It no longer howls in long dramatic bursts. Instead, it combs steadily across the buried prairie, a low and persistent rush that vibrates faintly through the earth. You wake to it without fully opening your eyes. The dugout seems to hum not loudly, but with a subtle resonance that reminds you how thin the boundary is between shelter and storm. You lie still and let the sound settle. The snow above has deepened further. You can feel it in the muted quality of everything. Even your own movements seem soft and absorbed before they travel far. When you shift under your blanket, the rustle barely reaches your ears. It's well documented that prairie blizzards were often accompanied by fierce winds capable of driving snow horizontally for hours at a time. Wind chills could plunge temperatures to life-threatening levels even when the thermometer itself did not seem catastrophic. Exposure was the true enemy. Out there, a person could freeze within minutes. Down here, you measure survival in increments of patience. You sit up slowly and rub your hands together. The air is crisp but manageable. The stove has gone cold again, and you cross the small room to feed it with practiced economy. Every stick of wood matters. You are careful not to overfeed the flames. A steady, modest fire is better than a brief blaze that consumes precious fuel. As the stove begins to tick and warm, you listen more carefully to the roof. The weight above has shifted overnight. Snow does not simply pile up and stay obedient. It drifts, compresses, slides in subtle movements that you cannot see but can sometimes hear. A faint scraping noise travels down through the beams, followed by a gentle thud as a portion of drift settles into a new shape. Researchers continue to debate how much structural knowledge early settlers possessed when building dugouts. Some argue that many relied on trial and error learning through harsh experience, which roof spans were safe and which were risky. Others suggest that migrants brought practical knowledge from earlier sod houses and earthen shelters in Europe and Russia. Standing here beneath these beams, you suspect that whatever the origin of the design, it evolved quickly under pressure. Winter is an unforgiving teacher. You approach the door once more. It has become heavier to move with each passing day. This time, when you push against it, a fine spray of powdered snow slips inward, catching the lamplight like glitter. You squint and raise a hand to shield your face. The cold that seeps through the opening feels sharper than before, as if the wind has found new strength. Digging out the entrance has become almost meditative. Scoop, lift, toss, scoop, lift, toss. Your breath forms steady clouds in the narrow tunnel you create. The snow nearest the surface is loose and airy. Deeper layers are denser, compacted by wind and time. You carve upward until at last you can pull yourself out onto the drifted surface. The landscape is transformed into a sculpted wilderness. Ridges curl like frozen waves. Small whirlwinds of snow dance briefly before dissolving. There are no footprints except your own, and even those begin to soften the moment you step away. One curious anecdote from frontier letters describes families tying ropes from their dugout doors to nearby barns or wells, creating lifelines during whiteouts. In heavy storms, people sometimes lost their bearings only steps from home. A simple rope could mean the difference between safety and fatal confusion. You glance back at the doorway and imagine how easily it might vanish if you linger too long. You retreat underground, sealing the door firmly. Inside, the dim glow of lamplight feels almost golden compared to the stark brilliance outside. The dugout has grown darker over the days as snow rises higher against the front wall. Light filters through the doorway in a pale wash, but the interior now relies more heavily on flame. You sit near the stove and extend your hands again. The warmth spreads gradually through your fingers, then into your wrists. There is something deeply grounding about this routine. Feed the fear. Clear the door. Listen to the roof. These tasks repeat, anchoring you against the monotony of endless white. The wind surges again this time, producing a low whistling tone as it moves across the snow-packed entrance tunnel. The sound resembles breath drawn through a narrow reed. It is eerie at first, then oddly soothing. The dugout responds with faint creaks, small adjustments in timbered soil. You tilt your head and focus on those subtle noises. A slight groan from a beam. A tiny cascade of grit falling from the wall where vibration has loosened it. None of it suggests imminent danger. Still, you remain attentive. Living beneath accumulated snow demands respect for small signals. Some modern observers might assume that such a setting would breed constant anxiety, yet many historical accounts reveal a surprising sense of calm among those who adapted to it. When the storm is relentless, resistance wastes energy. Acceptance conserves it. You begin to understand that distinction in your bones. The scent of earth seems richer today, mingled with the faint metallic tang of heated iron. Smoke curls lazily toward the low ceiling before drifting toward a simple vent pipe. Ventilation in dugouts required careful balance. Too little airflow risks smoke buildup. Too much invited icy drafts. The design of each shelter reflected its builder's understanding of that delicate equilibrium. You lean back against the wall and close your eyes for a moment. The wind's steady presence above feels less like an enemy now, and more like distant weather that happens to be occurring somewhere else. The snow has created layers between you and chaos. Earth timber drift. Each one absorbs a portion of the storm's fury before it reaches you. The roof creaks once more, a slow, deliberate sound. You open your eyes and glance upward. The beam holds firm. You take a slow breath and let it out. The dugout remains intact. The snow continues to fall. Another night of wind lies ahead. You will tend the stove again, you will listen. You will trust the weight above you to settle rather than collapse. And as the storm combs the plains without mercy, you settle deeper into the earth, feeling the strange reassurance of being hidden beneath it. You begin to measure time, not by calendar dates, but by the behaviour of warmth. Some mornings the stove catches quickly, flames rising with a cooperative crackle. Other days the wood resists damp from the subtle seep of underground air, and you crouch longer than you would like, coaxing life from reluctant embers. Heat here is never dramatic. It is earned, slowly guarded, carefully and shared without waste. You wake before dawn, though dawn is only a suggestion now. The snow outside reflects faint light even in darkness, casting a pale glow through the narrow doorway tunnel. The air inside the dugout feels cool but not punishing. You pull your blanket tighter around your shoulders and sit up listening for the familiar small sounds of the shelter adjusting to the temperature. It's widely recorded that Earth's sheltered homes maintain more stable internal temperatures than above-ground structures during extreme weather. Soil acts as a thermal buffer, absorbing warmth during milder periods and releasing it gradually when cold intensifies. Settlers did not use the term thermal mass, but they observed the effect keenly. A dugout might feel chilly at first light, yet it rarely matched the biting ferocity outside. You swing your legs to the floor and place your palm flat against the wall. The soil is cool, faintly damp to the touch, but not frozen. That difference matters. Frozen earth would signal deeper trouble. Instead, you feel a restrained steadiness, as if the land itself is lending you a portion of its stored memory of summer. The stove stands at the corner, squat and patient. You open its small iron door and stir the ashes from last night. A few glowing coals remain buried like tiny suns beneath grey powder. You add a thin piece of wood and watch as a faint tongue of flame licks upward. Heat begins in whispers. Outside the wind has lessened for now. Snow continues to fall but more gently. Repeated storms often arrived in waves, heavy gusts followed by eerie calms before the next front advanced. In those pauses, families tended repairs, checked animals and replenished fuel as best they could. You consider stepping out to assess the roofline later, but for the moment you focus on nurturing warmth. A curious detail preserved in personal journals mentions that some settlers hung quilts or extra blankets along interior walls during the coldest stretches. The fabric trapped pockets of air and reduced drafts that seeped through cracks in sod or timber. It was a simple solution, improvised and effective. You glance at the rough blanket draped near your bunk and appreciate its quiet service. As the fire strengthens, the iron stove begins to radiate a modest glow. You extend your hands toward it, palms tingling as sensation returns to stiff fingers. The warmth spreads outward in slow circles, reaching the nearest wall first, then the rest of the room. Earth does not surrender heat quickly, but it accepts it steadily. Scholars have long discussed how much fuel was required to sustain even a modest fire through prolonged winters on the plains. Some argue that scarcity forced families to adopt strict routines, burning only at certain hours and relying on heavy bedding at night. Others suggest that communities developed cooperative systems of wood gathering to prevent individual hardship. However it was managed, fuel was precious and extravagance was unthinkable. You feed the stove another small log and listen as it catches. The crackle becomes more confident. A faint shimmer of warmth travels up the vent pipe. Smoke curls upward and disappears into the narrow exit carved through roof and snow. Ventilation must remain open despite the drift above. Block chimneys were dangerous and careful attention to airflow was part of the daily survival. You glance upward instinctively, imagining the path the smoke takes. It rises through the packed earth, through layers of snow, and emerges into a world still swirling with flakes. From a distance, that faint plume might be the only sign that life continues beneath the white surface. You move around the room, slowly redistributing blankets, shaking out a wool coat that has absorbed the scent of earth and smoke. The dugout smells richer when the stove is lit. There is a sweetness to heated soil, a subtle fragrance that lingers in your hair and clothes. It is not the crisp scent of pine logs in a mountain cabin. It is heavier, more grounded, but no less comforting. When you finally push open the door to clear fresh accumulation, the contrast startles you. The cold bites sharply at your cheeks. Snow has drifted higher along the front wall, narrowing the entrance tunnel even further. You scoop methodically, careful not to exhaust yourself. Heat gained inside can be lost quickly through overexertion in freezing air. Returning to the dugout, you close the door and feel immediate relief. The stove's modest glow seems brighter after exposure. You sit once more near its warmth and reflect on how essential this small iron box has become. Without it, the earth walls alone might not suffice during the coldest nights. Together, soil and flame create a delicate partnership. Repeated snowstorms demand this partnership daily. Each storm strips heat from the landscape. Each calm period offers a brief opportunity to recover some measure of comfort. You learn to anticipate these cycles, to conserve energy when wind roars, to act decisively when skies soften. As the morning progresses, the dugout grows subtly warmer. Not dramatically so, but enough that you remove your gloves and flex your fingers freely. You take a slow breath and feel it enter without stinging. That alone feels like a victory. Outside, the storm prepares its next surge. You can sense the shift in air pressure the way light dims slightly at the doorway. But inside for this moment, warmth holds steady. You lean back against the earthen wall, close your eyes briefly, and allow yourself to appreciate the fragile equilibrium you have created. Heat from soil and stove carefully tended stands between you and a world of relentless white. The balance will need tending again soon. It always does. For now, though, the dugout hums softly with contained warmth and you remain at its quiet centre. By the time another night settles over the buried prairie, you have learned that warmth is only part of the equation. Sleep itself becomes an art form down here, shaped by layers of fabric, shared breath and careful positioning. You do not simply lie down, you arrange yourself with intention. The bunk is narrow, constructed from rough planks supported by simple braces driven into packed soil. On top rests a mattress stuffed with straw or dried grass contained within ticking that has seen better days. It rustles faintly when you press your weight into it. A documented detail from many frontier households is that feather mattresses were rare luxuries on the plains. Straw or corn husk filling was far more common, and it required periodic shaking and replacement to prevent matting and dampness. You smooth the blanket across the surface and sit testing the give. The straw shifts unevenly beneath you. Comfort is not plush, but it is serviceable. You remove your boots and set them close to the stove, careful not to scorch the leather. Frozen boots in the morning are a misery you would prefer to avoid. The air cools gradually as the stove burns lower for the night. Families often allowed fires to die down while they slept, conserving fuel and relying instead on heavy bedding and shared body heat. It was a calculated trade. A roaring fire all night would have consumed precious wood. A cooler room mitigated by thick blankets was more sustainable. You lie back and pull the woolen cover up to your chin. The fabric smells faintly of smoke and earth. Your breath forms small clouds that drift upward and vanish in the dimness. You shift slightly to create a pocket of warmth beneath the blanket. Within minutes, the air trapped around your body begins to feel noticeably warmer than the room itself. Scholars continue to examine how people adapted their sleeping arrangements during extreme winters. Some suggest that entire families often shared one large bed to conserve heat. Others point to descriptions of children sleeping crosswise at the foot of adult beds, maximizing contact and warmth. However it was arranged, proximity was practical, not merely sentimental. You turn onto your side and listen. The storm outside has quieted for the moment, but faint gusts still comb across the snow. The dugout amplifies certain sounds while muting others. The creak of a beam overhead feels intimate, almost personal. The distant wind feels far away, as though it belongs to another world. A small but intriguing anecdote preserved in a settler memoir mentions that frost sometimes formed delicate crystals on the inside walls near the doorway during the coldest nights. Children would trace patterns in the frost before it melted under morning warmth. You glance toward the entrance and notice a faint sparkle where moisture has condensed. It catches the lamplight like a scatter of tiny stars. You pull the blankets tighter and feel the heat of your own body settle into the straw mattress beneath you. Over time, the bedding itself retains warmth, creating a small reservoir that makes returning to sleep easier after waking. This cycle of heat retention becomes second nature. You learn to move minimally once warmth has gathered. Outside, another wave of snow begins to fall. You can hear it faintly against the packed earth above, a soft hiss that blends with the sound of your breathing. The snow does not strike the roof sharply anymore. It lands on layers already accumulated, producing a gentle compression rather than impact. You close your eyes and allow the rhythm to steady you. Sleep in a dugout during repeated snowstorms is not a dramatic surrender to exhaustion. It is a gradual yielding. You drift in and out of light awareness, occasionally waking to listen for unusual sounds. Is that beam creaking more than before? Has the wind shifted direction? Each time you assess, decide that all remain stable and sink back into warmth. It has been noted in weather accounts from the era that consecutive blizzards often produce deceptive lulls between them. A clear evening might suggest the worst had passed, only for another front to arrive by dawn. You have learned not to trust silence entirely. It may be genuine calm or merely the storm drawing breath. Still, the dugout holds. The earth walls surround you with a steady presence. The ceiling beams maintain their quiet vigil. The snow above thickens, adding insulation even as it adds weight. You shift once more, tucking your hands beneath the blanket near your chest. Your feet gradually lose their initial chill. The mattress rustles softly, then grows still. In this low earthen room, you feel both sheltered and hidden. The outside world has been reduced to muffled gusts and faint settling sounds. Here your focus narrows to breath fabric and the subtle warmth shared between body and bedding. The stove gives one last faint tick as it cools further. Darkness deepens, though it is never absolute. Snow reflects a pale glow through the entrance tunnel, enough to outline the beams above in faint relief. You drift towards sleep, again aware that morning will bring another round of digging, tending, listening. For now, though, the bunk cradles you in its imperfect way. The blankets hold your heat. The dugout shelters your breath from the unforgiving air beyond its walls. And as the storm continues its patient work above, you rest beneath layers of earth and snow, wrapped not in luxury but in resilience. You begin to notice that the world has changed not only in sight but in sound. Snow does not simply cover the land, it edits it. It removes sharp edges, trims away echoes, and folds distance inward until everything feels closer and farther at the same time. You wake before fully understanding what is different. The dugout feels deeper, more insulated from the outside than it did even yesterday. When you shift on the bunk, the straw rustles softly, yet the sound seems to fall straight down rather than travel outward. The ceiling beams hold their quiet. The wind, though still present, has lost its fierce pitch. It has long been observed in meteorological studies that fresh snow dramatically reduces ambient noise by trapping air between its crystalline structures. That trapped air absorbs vibrations, dampening sound waves. Settlers did not frame it in scientific language, but many left written descriptions of blizzards that made the world eerily silent, as if wrapped in thick cloth. You sit up and listen deliberately. The storm is not over. Snow continues to fall in steady sheets, yet it lands on existing drifts with a subdued whisper rather than a strike. The dugout feels almost submerged beneath it all, like a small chamber under a frozen sea. You rise and cross to the door, pausing before opening it. There is comfort in the muffled hush. The outside world, with all its danger and vastness, feels remote. For a moment you hesitate, reluctant to disturb that stillness. Then practicality wins. You push against the door and begin the familiar labour of clearing the entrance. When you finally peer out, the quiet is astonishing. The wind has dropped entirely for now. Snow falls straight down, thick and deliberate. The prairie stretches in all directions, smooth and unbroken, without a single visible landmark. Even your previous footprints have vanished. Accounts from severe winters on the plains frequently mention how repeated storms erased fences and trails, forcing families to navigate by memory alone. In some cases, people marked paths with tall stakes or scraps of cloth tied to poles, so they could find their way between structures when visibility improved. Without such markers, orientation could be dangerously uncertain. You retreat inside, brushing snow from your sleeves. The dugout greets you with its familiar scent of earth and faint smoke. The hush persists even after you close the door. Sound here behaves differently now. It feels as though it belongs to the room itself rather than travelling outward. There is a curious note in a frontier diary about children playing a game during long storms. They would clap their hands sharply and listen for how quickly the echo died. After heavy snowfall, the echo disappeared almost instantly. The game was a crude but effective demonstration of how thoroughly the storm absorbed sound. You smile faintly at the image and resist the temptation to test it yourself. Instead, you sit near the stove and feed it carefully. The crackle of wood seems louder than usual against the quiet backdrop. Each small pop of sap sounds distinct, like punctuation in an otherwise muted conversation. Researchers have occasionally debated how such prolonged sensory reduction affected the mental state of isolated settlers. Some propose that the quiet brought a sense of peace and focus. Others suggest that the monotony of white and the absence of varied sound could deepen feelings of confinement. As you sit here, you recognize both possibilities. The silence soothes you, yet it also sharpens your awareness of how small this room truly is. You tilt your head and listen to the roof. There is a faint sliding noise as a thin layer of snow shifts position. It is not alarming, merely a reminder that the storm continues its slow choreography above. The beams respond with a soft adjustment, a subtle settling that you have come to recognize as normal. You move about the dugout, adjusting a blanket hung near the wall to block a faint draft. Fabric and earth work together to maintain your fragile pocket of warmth. Every sound you make feels deliberate. Even your breathing seems amplified in your own ears. Later, when you lie back on the bunk, you become aware of a new sensation. The silence outside allows you to hear the faint rhythm of your heartbeat, especially when you rest your ear against the straw mattress. It is steady and grounding. In a world stripped of distant noise, your own body becomes part of the soundscape. Snow continues to fall. The roof grows heavier, yet the quiet deepens. The dugout feels more protected than ever, wrapped in layers that soften both cold and clamour. You realise that repeated snowstorms do more than test structural strength. They reshape perception itself. You close your eyes and listen one final time before drifting towards sleep. No wagon wheels, no barking dogs, no distant calls across the prairie. Only the faint crackle of a modest fire and the gentle compression of snow settling above. In this filtered world, you are tucked beneath silence as much as beneath earth. And as another night descends on the buried plains, you begin to understand that sound, or the lack of it, is as much a companion in this dugout as warmth or light. Hunger arrives with less ceremony than the storm, but it is just as persistent. You wake with a hollow feeling in your stomach that reminds you the body does not pause simply because the prairie has disappeared beneath snow. Repeated storms mean repeated days indoors, and that means careful attention to what remains in your small stores. You sit up on the bunk and glance toward the corner where sacks and crocks are arranged with deliberate neatness. Flour in one sack, dried beans in another, a small barrel of salted pork, its lid secured tightly, a tin of coffee if you are fortunate. Each item represents labour from months ago, now measured out in modest portions against the uncertainty of how long the snow will continue. Period homestead records indicate that winter provisions were calculated with grim seriousness. Families often slaughtered livestock in late autumn, preserving meat through salting and smoking. Root vegetables such as potatoes and turnips were stored in cellars or buried pits to prevent freezing. On the plains where cellars were sometimes impractical dugouts themselves served double duty as living quarters and storage spaces. The Earth's relatively stable temperature helped prevent food from freezing solid. You rise and move toward the flour sack, dipping a cup carefully into its pale contents. You level it with the back of a knife, mindful of waste. Every spoonful matters. You add water sparingly and mix the dough in a shallow pan, kneading it with slow economical movements. The smell of raw flour mingles with the earthy scent of the room. A small detail recorded in a settler's letter mentions that during particularly severe winters, some families flavoured their bread with whatever dried herbs they had saved from summer gardens simply to break the monotony. Imagine the faint hint of sage or thyme in otherwise plain flatbread, a quiet reminder of warmer months. You consider that possibility as you press the dough into simple rounds. The stove is already warm from your morning tending. You place the bread carefully on a small griddle and listen as it begins to cook. The faint sizzle feels almost luxurious. In a world of muted snow and filtered light, the smell of baking bread becomes a vivid event. Meanwhile, you assess the rest of your stores. Beans will stretch further than meat. Salted pork, though rich, must be rationed carefully. Coffee, if you have it, becomes both comfort and currency. It has been noted in economic accounts from frontier settlements that coffee was prized not only for its taste, but for the psychological lift it offered during long winters. You sit near the stove as the bread browns, turning it once with practiced care. The heat from the iron radiates outward, warming your knees where you crouch. When the bread is done, you break it open and watch steam curl upward. You eat slowly, savouring each bite rather than rushing through it. Outside, snow continues its quiet descent. The dugout feels insulated from urgency, yet supplies you to time. How many more days of flour remain? How many storms will follow this one? These questions linger in the background of every meal. Researchers studying homestead diaries have observed that rationing often became more strict after the first major blizzard of the season. The initial storm served as a warning, a reminder that isolation could stretch far longer than anticipated. You feel that shift now. You measure your beans with a slightly more cautious hand. After eating, you wipe the pan clean with a scrap of cloth. Water must also be conserved. Melting snow is possible, but it requires fuel and effort. Whenever conditions allow families filled barrels during milder days, anticipating times when stepping outside would be risky. You glance toward the door and consider the depth of the drift beyond it. Fetching additional snow for melting would not be difficult, but it would cost energy. You decide to wait until the next lull in the wind. Energy management becomes as vital as food management during repeated snowstorms. The dugout's small interior seems almost companionable as you settle back onto the bunk. You chew thoughtfully, listening to the steady quiet outside. Food tastes different here. Simpler, perhaps sharper against the backdrop of cold. You're more aware of texture of warmth spreading from stomach to limbs. Some historians have suggested that monotony of diet during prolonged winters contributed to both physical and emotional strain among settlers. Yet others argue that routine meals provided structure and reassurance. In the absence of changing scenery, the predictability of bread and beans offered a kind of comfort. As you sit here, you recognize the truth in that. You set aside a portion of bread for later and cover it carefully. Waste is unthinkable. The storms outside have stripped the prairie of abundance for now. What you have inside these walls must suffice. Another gust brushes the roof, sending a faint ripple through the beams. You look up instinctively, then relax as the sound fades. The dugout remains firm. You lean back against the earthen wall, hands resting loosely in your lap. Your hunger has softened, replaced by a gentle warmth that spreads outward from within. The snow may continue to fall. The storms may repeat themselves in relentless sequence. But for this moment you have eaten. You have warmed your hands. You have stretched your provisions another day. And in the quiet glow of the stove beneath a roof layered with earth and drift that feels like enough. It is not the cold that unsettles you most now. It is the damp. After days of snow pressing against the walls and roof, moisture begins to find subtle paths inward, not in dramatic leaks, not in sudden streams, but in faint darkening patches along the packed soil. You notice them first near the doorway where snow has built up thickest. The earth there feels slightly cooler to the touch, faintly slick beneath your fingers. You crouch and press your palm against the wall. The soil holds firm, but it yields a trace of moisture that clings to your skin. It is a reminder that the dugout is not a sealed chamber. It breathes with the land. Snow melts during brief lulls, seeps downward, then refreezes as temperatures shift again. The cycle repeats quietly and visibly, shaping your shelter from the outside. Records from frontier settlements often mention that moisture management was one of the most persistent challenges of earthen homes. Builders sometimes lined interior walls with boards when they could afford them, creating a barrier between living space and raw soil. Others dug shallow trenches around the exterior to divert meltwater away from the structure. In prolonged winters with repeated snowfall and intermittent thaws, those precautions could determine whether a dugout remained livable. You fetch a small rag and press it gently against the damp patch, absorbing what little has seeped through. The action feels almost ceremonial, a small defense against a slow encroachment. The floor remains mostly dry thanks to its slight slope toward the door, but you remain vigilant. Mud underfoot would chill the room more quickly than dry packed earth. The stove as always becomes your ally. Heat does more than warm your hands. It dries. The air pulls moisture from the walls and restores a sense of balance. You feed it carefully, watching as the flame strengthens and the faint sheen on the soil begins to dull. There is a curious note preserved in a homesteader's journal about families scattering a thin layer of ashes along damp sections of floor to absorb moisture. Ash abundant from the stove served as a simple drying agent. You glance at the small pile near the hearth and consider the wisdom of that practice. Nothing is wasted here. Not heat, not food, not even residue. Outside, the storm has eased into a fine, persistent snowfall. The sky remains heavy, but the wind has withdrawn for now. This brief calm allows melt to begin beneath the thickest drifts, especially where sunlight filters faintly through thinning clouds. That meltwater seeks gravity, and gravity leads it toward your walls. Researchers examining the structural durability of sod and dugout homes often point to moisture as the most significant long-term threat. Soil that is too dry can crumble. Soil that is too wet can slump. The ideal balance lies somewhere in between, maintained through careful ventilation and steady heating. You feel as though you are tending not just a room, but a living organism that responds to every change in weather. You move toward the doorway and open it slightly to improve airflow. A thin bourbon of cold air slips inside sharp against your cheeks. You allow it to circulate briefly before closing the door again. Too much ventilation will undo the warmth you have built. Too little will trap dampness. Every decision here is a negotiation. As evening approaches, you notice the ceiling beams more closely. The logs appear darkened near their edges, where moisture has condensed and then dried again. They hold steady, but you remain attentive. Repeated cycles of thaw and freeze contest even sturdy timber. You run your fingers along the underside of one beam, feeling its grain. It is rough and solid, carrying the weight of earth and snow without visible strain. Above it, layers of drift shift subtly as temperatures fluctuate. The sound is faint, a soft internal settling rather than an external crash. Another anecdote from prairie life tells of families placing small bowls beneath minor drips, catching water before it could pool on the floor. The collected melt was sometimes used for washing or even added to cooking pots. It was not pristine, but it was practical. You glance around the room, noting that no such drips have formed yet. Still, you remain prepared. Night deepens, and with it comes a renewed drop in temperature. The damp patches along the wall begin to firm again, moisture tightening back into the soil as frost creeps inward. You touch the surface once more and find it cool but no longer slick. The dugout has adjusted. You settle onto the bunk, pulling your blanket close. The scent of earth feels stronger tonight, richer with the memory of moisture. It is not unpleasant, it is simply present, an honest reflection of where you are. Outside the cycle continues. Snow falls, pauses, melts, slightly freezes again. Each repetition reshapes the drifted landscape and presses gently against your shelter. Inside you answer each shift with small corrections, a hotter fire, a bit of ash on the floor, a brief opening of the door. Living in a dugout during repeated snowstorms is not a single act of endurance. It is an ongoing conversation with cold and damp, with weight and warmth. You listen, you respond. The earth listens in return. As you close your eyes, you feel the room steady around you. The walls remain upright, the beams hold, the floor stays dry beneath your boots. The storm may return with greater force tomorrow. Moisture may creep again along the edges of your walls, but tonight the balance holds. And beneath layers of snow and soil, you sleep in a space that breathes with the weather adapting quietly to every shift above. Morning arrives with a dull pressure against the door. You do not even need to look to know that the drift has climbed higher overnight. The air feels denser somehow, as if the snow outside has thickened the very atmosphere. You sit up slowly, joints stiff from another night on straw and wool, and listen for any unusual sounds from the roof. Everything seems steady. Clearing the buried doorway has become your first ritual of the day. Before food, before stretching warmth into your fingers, you must reopen your connection to the outside world. You cross the small room and rest your palm against the wooden planks of the door. They feel cold but solid. Contemporary weather, accounts from the late 19th century, describe blizzards that deposited snow so quickly that doors could be sealed shut within hours. In some regions of the plains, repeated storms formed drifts that rose higher than single-story structures. Dugouts set low into the earth often found themselves nearly submerged, requiring careful tunneling to re-establish access to light and air. You brace your shoulder and push. The door resists, then yields a fraction. Powdered snow spills inward in a fine cascade. You step back, reach for the shovel, and begin to carve a narrow channel upward. The motion is rhythmic now. Scoop, lift, press aside. The snow nearest the door is compacted, almost granular, shaped by wind and weight. Your breath fogs the small tunnel you create. For a moment you imagine yourself as some winter animal emerging from a den. The comparison is not far from reality. Dugout dwellers during harsh winters often describe their homes as burrows, not as a complaint, but as a practical description of form and function. There is an odd little story preserved in a frontier memoir about children delighting in these snow tunnels, pretending they were explorers digging through glaciers. What for adults was labour became at least occasionally a source of wonder for the young. You allow yourself a faint smile at that image as you widen the passage. When you finally break through to open air, light floods the narrow shaft. It is blinding at first, reflecting off the endless white. You shield your eyes and pull yourself up onto the drift. The dugout's roofline is invisible beneath snow, the only marker being the chimney pipe protruding like a thin black reed. A faint plume of smoke rises from it, proof that life persists below. Wind brushes across the surface, not violently today, but with enough force to reshape the top layer of powder. Your footprints from yesterday are gone. Even the shallow trench you carved then has been softened by fresh accumulation. It is as if the land refuses to acknowledge human effort for long. Some scholars examining settler narratives have noted how this daily erasure affected morale. The act of digging out the doorway only to repeat the same task hours later could feel futile. Yet others argue that the repetition itself offered structure and purpose during otherwise monotonous days. You sense that both interpretations hold truth. The labour is wearying, but it also anchors you. You descend back into the dugout and close the door behind you, sealing in what warmth remains. Snow clings to your coat and melts quickly near the stove, dripping faintly onto the sloped floor. You brush it away before it can pool. Inside, the contrast is immediate. The room feels dimmer than it did a few days ago. With drifts rising higher along the exposed wall, less natural light filters through the entrance. The dugout's interior takes on a deeper, earthier tone lit mostly by flame. You set the shovel aside and kneel by the stove, feeding it carefully. The iron responds with a soft crackle. Heat spreads outward once more, reclaiming the space that cold tried to encroach on. Clearing the doorway is not merely about access. It is about ventilation. Fresh air must circulate to prevent smoke buildup and to keep the interior from growing stale. It is about safety too. In rare cases, entire entrances became so thoroughly buried that families had to dig emergency exits through roofs or sidewalls. That possibility lingers at the back of your mind, urging vigilance. You stand and glance toward the ceiling beams. They remain steady, bearing the accumulated weight without visible strain. The snow above has grown thick, but it presses evenly for now. There is a quiet satisfaction in seeing the narrow tunnel of light you have carved. It is small, almost insignificant against the vast drift outside, yet it represents connection. A line between your earthen room and the wider world. You sit back on the bunk and rub your hands together, feeling warmth return. The act of digging has flushed your cheeks and stirred your blood. For a moment you feel almost invigorated. Repeated snowstorms may bury the doorway again by afternoon. They may force you to repeat this ritual tomorrow and the day after. Still, each time you reopen that passage, you reaffirm your presence here. You refuse to be sealed away entirely. Outside the prairie remains a featureless expanse of white. Inside the dugout holds steady, its walls firm, its beams patient. You glance once more at the narrow shaft of light by the door and feel a small, steady resolve settle within you. The storm can close the sky as often as it wishes. You will keep carving a way back to it. The light grows thinner with each passing day. Not darker exactly, but filtered as if the sun must negotiate with layers of snow before reaching you. By afternoon, the dugout rests in a muted half-glow, the doorway tunnel casting a pale rectangle across the dirt floor. Beyond that narrow bem, shadows gather comfortably in corners. You realise how much you rely on flame now. The small oil lamp and the iron stove do more than provide warmth. They define the boundaries of your world. When the wick is trimmed and lit, the room sharpens into clarity. When it burns low, the walls seem to inch closer, the ceiling beams looming heavier above. Settler accounts from long winters frequently note that artificial light was rationed carefully. Oil candles and even lamp wicks were precious supplies. In some dugouts, families timed their evenings by the length of a single candle, extinguishing it early to conserve resources. Light was not taken for granted. It was portioned like flour. You sit at the small rough table near the stove and adjust the lamp's wick. The flame flutters, then steadies, casting a warmer glow across the packed earth walls. Shadows ripple gently with each flicker. The scent of heated oil mingles with smoke and soil. It is a layered fragrance now familiar and grounding. Outside, the storm has paused again, but clouds still blanket the sky. Even during daylight, the world feels subdued. Snow reflects brightness, yet the heavy overcast dulls its brilliance. The result is a strange in-between state, neither fully bright nor comfortably dark. There is a modest comfort in lamplight during repeated snowstorms. It creates a centre. You gather near it instinctively, whether but to mend a glove check supplies or simply sit and listen. The rest of the dugout recedes into gentle obscurity, but the circle of light remains steady. An intriguing detail appears in some frontier reminiscences about families using mirrors to amplify lamplight in small spaces. A simple reflective surface placed behind a lamp could double its reach, stretching precious illumination further across a room. You glance at the dull tin plate hanging on a peg and imagine angling it just so catching more glow for less oil. Practical ingenuity thrives in confined spaces. You rise and test the door briefly, ensuring the tunnel remains open enough for ventilation. Fresh air slides inward in a thin stream. Without it, smoke from the stove and lamp would gather too thickly. Too much air, however, would sap warmth. Every adjustment requires judgment. Researchers who study domestic life on the plains often emphasize how winter altered daily rhythms. With daylight limpid and storms frequent, evenings stretched longer. Activities shifted closer to the hearth. Work that demanded precision moved into the brightest hours. Once darkness fell, conversation quiet mending, or simple rest took precedence. You return to the table and run your fingers along its rough surface. The wood bears small nicks and stains from previous meals and tasks. Lamplight highlights these imperfections, making them appear almost decorative. In brighter conditions, they might look crude. Here they look like proof of endurance. The ceiling beams catch your attention again. In this light, their texture becomes pronounced, each grain casting its own small shadow. You listen for any unusual strain. The snow above remains heavy, but the structure has not shifted beyond its usual murmurs. Another wave of snowfall begins outside, soft and steady. You hear it faintly against the packed layers above. The sound blends with the crackle of the stove and the gentle hiss of the lamp flame. Together they form a kind of winter lullaby. It has been observed in psychological studies of isolation that steady, predictable sensory input can provide comfort during confinement. The repeated sounds of fire and falling snow may have played such a role for those enduring long winters underground. As you sit here, you sense how those rhythms calm the mind, narrowing focus to the immediate and manageable. You lift the lamp carefully and carry it toward the bunk, setting it on a small crate nearby. The glow softens the edges of your bedding, casting warm tones across wool and straw. The rest of the dugout fades into shadow, but it no longer feels threatening. It feels contained. There is something intimate about lamplight in a dugout. It does not attempt to conquer darkness. It simply pushes it back enough to function. That modest ambition mirrors your own during these repeated storms. You're not seeking to dominate winter. You're carving out just enough space to live within it. You lower yourself onto the bunk and pull your blanket close. The lamp flickers gently, projecting faint shapes along the wall. Outside, the snow thickens again, layering more weight over the roof. Inside, the circle of light remains steady. As you close your eyes, the glow warms your eyelids, even through fabric. The dugout breathes quietly around you. Flame, earth, and snow coexist in careful balance. The sky may be hidden, but here in this low earthen room, a small steady light holds the darkness at bay. Sleep changes when storms repeat themselves. It becomes lighter, more alert, threaded with moments of listening. You no longer sink fully into unconsciousness without first measuring the room around you. Even in warmth, even beneath thick blankets, part of you remains tuned to the faint language of beams and drifting snow. You lie on your back and watch the lamplight fade as you lower the wick. The ceiling beams glow softly for a moment before retreating into shadow. The stove has been fed just enough to hold a low heat through the early hours. Beyond that, you will rely on bedding and the earth's steady reserve. There is a quiet understanding in this routine. Nights during prolonged blizzards required vigilance. Not constant fear, but periodic awareness. Historical weather reports from the plains describe roofs sagging under sudden accumulations, especially when wind packed snow unevenly against one side of a structure. Families sometimes rose in shifts to check supports or clear excessive drift from vulnerable areas when conditions allowed. You turn onto your side and close your eyes, yet you do not fully release attention. The dugout has its own cadence. A slight creak as a beam adjusts, a faint sigh as snow settles. The stove emits a small metallic tick as its iron cools and contracts. None of these sounds alarm you. They are part of the room's breathing. There is a small anecdote recorded in a homesteader's account about placing a simple string across the ceiling, beams tied loosely from one side to another. If the string slackened or tightened noticeably, it signalled structural movement that might require attention. Whether widely practiced or not, the idea reveals the creativity born of necessity. You glance upward, imagining such a line stretching overhead like a silent sentinel. Outside, the wind begins to rise again. It does not roar immediately. It builds gradually, brushing across the drifted surface before intensifying. The sound filters down through layers of snow and earth, arriving as a muted rush. You open your eyes and listen. Scholars examining frontier resilience often note that adaptation to environmental extremes involved not only physical labour but mental calibration. settlers learned to distinguish between ordinary structural noises and genuine warning signs. That skill reduced panic and conserved energy. As you lie here, you practice that same discernment. The creak you just heard is familiar. The roof remains steady. You pull the blanket closer around your shoulders and adjust your position slightly to preserve warmth. The straw mattress rustles softly, then grows still again. You place one hand lightly against the wall beside you, feeling its cool firmness. The soil is steady, neither damp nor crumbling. The wind intensifies for a brief stretch, sending a ripple through the snow above. A faint sliding sound travels across the roofline, followed by a dull thump as a small section of drift shifts position. You hold your breath for a moment, then release it when no further movement follows. The dugout has absorbed the adjustment. Living beneath repeated snowstorms reshapes your relationship with night. Darkness no longer signals simple rest. It becomes a shared watch between you and the structure around you. You sleep, but you also listen. At some point you drift deeper. Dreams come lightly shaped by muffled sounds and the memory of white landscapes. You wake again briefly when the stove emits another soft tick. The air has cooled slightly but not severely. You consider rising to add another small piece of wood, then decide the temperature remains tolerable. Conservation matters. Meteorological studies of historic blizzards suggest that wind speed often fluctuated dramatically during the night, producing cycles of strain and relief for exposed structures. Dugouts shielded by earth fared better than many frame houses in such conditions. That fact provides quiet reassurance as another gust passes overhead. You roll onto your other side and nestle deeper into the blanket. The dugout ceiling beams loom just above your line of sight, dark against darker shadow. You no longer view them with suspicion. They have proven themselves through several storms already. There is comfort in this gradual accumulation of trust. Each night that passes without incident strengthens your confidence in the shelter. Each creak that resolves without collapse becomes part of a pattern you understand. The wind subsides again toward early morning. Snow continues to fall but gently. The dugout grows quieter once more. Your listening softens. As you slip back toward deeper sleep, you recognize that this absence between vigilance and rest has become second nature. You're not constantly afraid, you're attentive. Above you, snow thickens the blanket over earth and timber. Around you, soil holds firm. Within you, breath rises and falls in steady rhythm. Night gives way slowly to the pale suggestion of dawn beyond the entrance tunnel. You have kept watch without fully waking. The dugout has kept watch with you. And as another morning approaches beneath layers of accumulated storm, you realize that survival here depends as much on quiet awareness as on strength. The days begin to blur into one another, especially when storms return in steady succession. Light fades early, wind rises and falls, snow accumulates and settles, and the dugout remains your small constant world. If there are children here with you, their energy does not just vanish simply because the prairie has been erased. It shifts inward, bouncing softly off earthen walls. You watch as small hands trace patterns in the dust along the floor, careful not to disturb the packed slope near the door. The room is not large yet. It must contain movement, or curiosity, and occasional restlessness. Winter confinement tests patience in ways that summer never does. Contemporary family letters from severe winters often mention the challenge of keeping children occupied when travel was impossible for days or weeks. Simple game storytelling and small chores became essential tools for maintaining order and morale. In dugouts, especially where space was limited, creativity mattered as much as provisions. You sit near the stove and demonstrate how to shape bits of dough into small figures before baking. The shapes are uneven, more suggestion than sculpture, yet they draw smiles. Bread becomes both food and play. The scent of it rising from the griddle transforms the room for a few minutes into something lighter. There is a charming anecdote recorded in one pioneer reminiscence about children pressing tiny handprints into the soft earth walls of a newly dug shelter, leaving impressions that hardened over time. Years later, those prints remained small markers of early winters endured. You glance at the walls and imagine faint outlines hidden beneath layers of awoken soil. Outside, snow falls again, steady and patient. Inside, the air hums faintly with small movements. A blanket becomes a makeshift tent for a few moments, draped over the bunk to create a private nook. Laughter rises briefly, then quiets when reminded that energy must be conserved. Researchers who examine social dynamics in isolated frontier homes have suggested that shared routines strengthened family bonds during harsh seasons. With no external distractions, conversation and cooperation became central. You see that truth in the way tasks are divided without fuss. One stirs the stove, another folds blankets. Someone else watches the door for signs of shifting drift. You rise and cross to the entrance tunnel, checking its narrow opening. Fresh snow has begun to creep inward along the edges. You brush it aside, gently maintaining airflow. The act itself becomes a small lesson in responsibility, one that even the youngest can observe and eventually imitate. Returning to the warmth of the stove, you listen to the soft murmur of voices in the dim light. The dugout feels smaller when filled with movement, yet also more alive. Shadows shift across the ceiling beams as someone passes between lamp and wall. There is an unspoken understanding that noise must remain measured. Loud shouting could strain tempers or unsettle the fragile calm of the space. Still quiet games flourish. Counting objects, whispered stories about summers past, imagined adventures beyond the drifted horizon. It's been argued by some historians that prolonged winter confinement influenced storytelling traditions among frontier families. Without access to public gatherings or printed entertainment, oral tales took on greater significance. You sense that pattern here in the way voices soften and draw listeners closer. You lean back against the earthen wall and observe the interplay of light and shadow. The stove crackles gently sung. A small figure curls up near the bunk wrapped in wool. Outside, wind brushes across the buried prairie but does not penetrate fully. The dugout, though humble, becomes a kind of winter classroom. Lessons in patience and cooperation and careful use of space. Even games reflect the environment. You find yourself drawing simple maps in the dirt, tracing where the barn might be beyond the drift, where the well stands hidden under snow. Memory substitutes for sight. As evening approaches, you notice fatigue settling more quickly. Long days indoors can feel heavy despite minimal physical exertion. You encourage quiet rest, lowering the lamp wick slightly to signal the approach of night. Snow continues to fall. The world beyond the door remains unreachable for now. Yet inside this earthen room, life persists in small, steady rhythms. You gather blankets and help arrange bedding once more. The bunk creaks softly as weight shifts. Breath mingles in the cool air. Repeated snowstorms confine bodies, but they also draw attention inward to shared warmth and whispered stories. As you settle for the night, you recognize that the dugout shelters not only from wind and cold, but from loneliness. And beneath layers of snow that erase the prairie above, quiet companionship fills the space below. There are others out there. You know this even when the prairie has vanished into a seamless field of white. Beyond the drifted horizon, beyond the smoothed-over fences and buried paths, neighbours endure the same wind, the same weight of snow pressing against their roofs. The knowledge steadies you. You stand at the doorway tunnel one pale morning and look out across the blank landscape. The sky hangs low and grey. No chimney smoke is visible from here, no movement breaks the surface. Yet you remember where the nearest homestead lies, a mile, perhaps slightly east, years beyond what used to be a shallow rise in the land. Memory replaces sight in winter. Diaries from frontier communities frequently describe how repeated blizzards intensified isolation. Even homes only a short distance apart could feel separated by miles once drifts rose and visibility dropped. Travel became dangerous, sometimes impossible, until winds eased and paths were re-established. You close the door and return inside, feeling the subtle compression of the air as it seals. The dugout feels especially enclosed today, the walls close and dim. You imagine similar rooms scattered across the prairie, each holding its own small circle of lamplight and breath. There is a practical side to this separation. Fewer visits mean fewer shared resources during storms. Each household must rely primarily on its own stores. At the same time, there is a quiet understanding that when the weather clears, neighbours will check on one another. Mutual aid was not merely kindness on the plains, it was necessity. An interesting note preserved in a county of history recounts how after one particularly severe winter, families organised coordinated searches for missing livestock and isolated settlers once the snow receded enough to allow safe travel. The storm separated them temporarily, but community reasserted itself afterward with determination. You sit near the stove and picture the nearest dugout. Perhaps its roof is buried even deeper than yours. Perhaps its doorway has been sealed and reopened multiple times already today. The thought creates a subtle thread of connection, invisible yet real. Outside, the wind begins to rise again, scattering loose snow across the surface. You listen to its faint rush filtered through layers of earth. Travel in such conditions would be reckless. Historical weather summaries note that whiteouts during blizzards disoriented even experienced plainsmen, sometimes with tragic results. Ropes tied between buildings, as you have heard before, were one solution. Patience was another. You glance at your supplies, counting once more without touching them. Flour remains sufficient. Beans will stretch further. Firewood is modest but manageable if storms do not linger beyond expectation. You wonder how your neighbours fare. Do they have enough fuel? Has their roof held firm under the accumulated drift? Some scholars examining settlement patterns have suggested that the spacing of homesteads influence survival rates during harsh winters. Homes placed too far apart limited rapid assistance. Yet proximity also risks shared exposure to drifting snow and wind patterns. The debate remains unresolved, but you feel the weight of distance more acutely now. You rise and check the chimney pipe, ensuring smoke flows freely. A faint plume drifts upward, outside barely visible through falling flakes. It may not be seen by anyone else, yet it signals life. If skies clear, even briefly, that thin column could reassure someone scanning the horizon. Inside, you adjust a blanket along the wall to reduce draft. The room feels steady, though dim. The lamp casts a soft circle of light across the table. Shadows gather at the edges, reminding you how confined the space truly is. There is a peculiar comfort in imagining others performing similar routines at this same hour. Another shovel biting into drift. Another stove being coaxed to life. Another set of hands smoothing wool blankets before nightfall. The prairie may be erased visually, but its network of lives persists beneath the snow. As evening approaches, wind intensifies, again driving snow against the exposed wall. You hear its muffled impact and picture the drift climbing incrementally higher. For now, you remain where you are. Venturing out would serve little purpose. You settle onto the bunk and allow your thoughts to wander outward. Isolation during repeated snowstorms is physical, but it need not be emotional. Memory bridges the distance. Anticipation of clearer days sustains you. It has been noted in sociological analyses of frontier communities that shared hardship often strengthened collective identity. Surviving the same storm season forged bonds that extended well beyond winter. You sense that truth in the quiet conviction that when the thaw comes, stories will be exchanged. Comparisons made. Laughter shared over the sheer absurdity of being buried yet again. For now, though, the dugout remains your entire world. Earth walls, low beams, dim light. Outside, the prairie waits beneath a deepening blanket. Somewhere beyond that white expanse, neighbours keep their own watch. And as the wind combs the surface once more, you lie back beneath layers of soil and snow, knowing that though unseen, you are not alone in this long winter. Fatigue settles differently when storms come in waves. It is not the sharp exhaustion of a single crisis. It is a slow accumulation, like the snow itself, layering quietly until you realise you're carrying more than you intended. You wake later than usual, not because you slept deeply, but because there is little to distinguish one grey morning from another. The entrance tunnel glows faintly, though the light seems thinner than yesterday. The air inside feels stable, neither especially warm nor biting. Everything hovers in a kind of suspended sameness. Extended winters on the plains were known not only for their physical challenges, but for their psychological toll. Period letters sometimes describe a weariness that went beyond cold or hunger. Repeated storms, limited movement, reduced social contact, and blurred the passage of time. It was a quieter strain, less visible but deeply felt. You sit on the edge of the bunk and rub your eyes. The ceiling beams look unchanged, steady as ever. The walls remain firm. Supplies, when counted, are still adequate. Nothing dramatic has shifted. Yet the repetition itself feels heavy. Another day of clearing the doorway. Another day of tending the stove. Another measured portion of flour. Each task is manageable, even simple. It is the endlessness that presses gently against your thoughts. There is a small anecdote preserved in a frontier woman's journal about marking days by carving faint lines into a wooden spoon handle. Not out of despair, but to maintain a sense of progress when storms prevented normal routines. The act of marking time restored a feeling of forward motion. You glance at the rough table and consider how you might mark this stretch of winter if needed. You rise and move toward the door, shovel in hand. The drift has built again, though not as severely as before. The work requires effort, but it no longer surprises you. Scoop lift clear, your muscles know the rhythm. When you finally stand outside for a moment, the sky remains a uniform grey. Snow falls lightly, almost lazily, as if the storm itself has grown tired. There is no horizon, no distinct landmark, only a vast expanse of white merging with a pale sky. Returning inside, you brush snow from your coat and close the door firmly. The dugout greets you with its familiar scent. Earth and smoke, wool and faint dampness. These smells have become the background of your days. Researchers examining accounts of prolonged winter confinement have noted that small variations in routine can significantly lift spirits. Rearranging furniture, slightly cooking a different recipe if ingredients allow, telling a new story rather than repeating an old one. Such modest changes counteract monotony. You decide to shift the table a few inches closer to the stove. It is a minor adjustment, barely noticeable, yet it alters the feel of the room. The light falls differently now. Shadows gather in new patterns along the wall. As the day stretches on, you notice your thoughts drifting more frequently to spring, to the memory of open sky and green grass. The mind reaches outward, even when the body cannot. This quiet longing does not weaken you. It reminds you that winter, however persistent, is not eternal. You feed the stove with deliberate care, watching the flame brighten. The crackle feels reassuring. Heat spreads gradually across the floor. Scholars have discussed how seasonal cycles shaped resilience among early settlers. The expectation of eventual thaw provided a mental anchor during the harshest weeks. Survival was not framed as endless endurance, but as passage through a defined season. As you sit here, you lean on that understanding. Evening descends with a little ceremony. The lamp is lit. The circle of light returns. Outside, snow continues its patient descent. You stretch out on the bunk earlier than usual, not from exhaustion, but from a desire to close the day. The ceiling beams remain steady overhead. The walls hold firm, the floor stays dry. Fatigue from repeated storms does not come with a single dramatic collapse. It seeps in gently like dampness along a wall. But just as you manage moisture with heat and attention, you manage weariness with routine and small adjustments. You close your eyes and focus on breath. Inhale, exhale. The dugout hums softly with contained warmth. Wind brushes faintly across the drifted surface above. Another day has passed beneath layers of snow. The storm has not conquered you. It has merely extended its stay. And as sleep approaches once more, you allow the steady rhythm of your shelter to carry you forward into the next grey morning. You begin to notice the small imperfections. Not cracks exactly, but subtle shifts. A faint gap where packed soil meets timber. A slight dip along one edge of the ceiling where snow has settled more heavily. Repeated storms do not announce danger loudly. They test quietly over time. You stand in the center of the dugout and tilt your head upward, studying the beams with a careful eye. The central support post remains upright solid against the packed floor. The logs overhead show no splintering. Still, the accumulated weight above is undeniable. Engineering studies of early sod and dugout structures suggest that evenly distributed load was crucial for stability. Snow, when allowed to drift unevenly, could create pressure points that stressed specific sections of roof more than others. Builders who anticipated this often reinforced ceilings with additional crossbeams or interior posts during heavy winters. You recall that detail as you consider whether your shelter requires adjustment. You fetch a spare timber kept along the wall originally intended as extra bracing. It is not elegant, but it is sturdy. You wedge it gently between floor and beam, creating an additional support beneath a section that has begun to sag ever so slightly. The action feels preventative rather than urgent. There is a practical story recorded in a county archive about a family who added interior braces midwinter after noticing minor creaks in their roof. The reinforcements held through the remainder of the season, and the shelter survived intact. The account is brief, almost mundane, yet it illustrates how attentiveness could avert catastrophe. You step back and assess the change. The added post stands firm, its base pressed securely into packed earth. The ceiling above appears steadier already, though perhaps that is partly reassurance. Academic discussions about frontier housing sometimes explore whether dugouts were inherently safer than above-ground frame houses during severe winters. Some researchers argue that earth provided superior insulation and wind resistance. Others counter that moisture and roof collapse pose significant risks. The evidence varies by region and construction quality. Standing here beneath reinforced beams, you appreciate the complexity of that debate. You run your hand along the earthen wall near the ceiling, feeling for loosened soil. A few crumbs fall to the floor. You brush them aside and consider applying a thin layer of dampened clay to smooth the surface. Even minor repairs contribute to long-term stability. Outside wind resumes with renewed vigor, driving snow against the exposed wall. You hear its muffled impact, a soft percussion filtered through layers of drift. The new support post remains steady. You move toward the door and open it briefly to inspect the exterior roofline from the entrance. Snow has formed a gentle slope over the buried structure, though one side appears slightly higher than the other. Ideally, weight would be balanced. When conditions permit, you may need to pack or remove snow from specific areas to even the load. There is a small but vivid recollection from a settler's memoir, describing men climbing onto their dugout roofs during a lull to redistribute snow with shovels, laughing at the absurdity of shaping their own winter cover. The humour masked the seriousness of the task. Proper balance meant survival. You close the door quickly as wind gusts stronger, sealing the warmth inside. The stove crackles, faintly oblivious to structural concerns. Its steady heat continues to dry and fortify the earthen walls. Reinforcement work inside a confined space demands patience. You adjust the spare timber once more, ensuring it sits flush against the beam. The wood creaks softly as pressure redistributes, then it grows quiet. Researchers studying adaptation strategies among homesteaders often emphasize the importance of incremental repairs rather than waiting for visible failure. In environments defined by extremes, proactive maintenance reduced risk dramatically. You sense the wisdom of that approach as you step back and examine the room. The dugout looks much as it did yesterday. Low ceiling, packed walls, modest furnishings. Yet the added support post changes the feeling subtly. It introduces a note of reassurance, a reminder that you are not merely enduring the storms but responding to them. Evening settles slowly. The lamp is lit. The shadows fall differently now, broken by the new timber rising from floor to ceiling. It becomes part of the room's geometry, part of its quiet story. Outside snow thickens once more. Inside beams hold firm under reinforced care. You sit near the stove and rest your hands in its warmth, aware that survival here depends on noticing small shifts before they grow large. As you prepare for sleep, you glance upward one final time. The ceiling no longer draws your concern. The added brace stands ready, sharing the burden of drift and earth. Repeated snowstorms test every structure, every routine. Tonight the dugout meets that test with quiet strength, supported not only by timber and soil, but by your steady attention. By now the dugout has a scent that belongs only to winter. It is layered and unmistakable. Warm soil, faintly metallic stove heat wool that has absorbed smoke and the subtle trace of damp clay drying near the doorway. When you inhale deeply, you can almost separate the notes, yet together they form a single atmosphere that feels both grounding and enclosing. You wake before first light and notice the air carries that familiar richness more strongly today. The stove has burned low and the coolness allows the earth to assert itself. Packed soil has a fragrance when warmed and cooled repeatedly. It is not unpleasant. It is steady, mineral, honest. Environmental historians studying frontier dwellings have often remarked on how sensory experience shaped memory. Many settlers later recalled the smell of their first dugout winters with surprising clarity even decades afterward. Scent more than sight tethered them to specific seasons and hardships. As you sit up on the bunk and draw in another breath, you understand how such impressions endure. You stir the stove gently, coaxing flame from embers. As heat begins to spread, the room's scent shifts subtly. Smoke threads through the earthiness, softening it. The iron pipe warms and emits a faint metallic tang that blends into the background. There is an understated story found in a prairie memoir about a family who hung dried herbs from the ceiling beams during winter, partly for flavour in cooking, partly to freshen the air. Sage and wild mint collected in summer released faint aromas when warmed by the stove. The gesture was small, almost symbolic, yet it brought a hint of green memory into the brown and white world of winter. You glance up at the beams and imagine such sprigs suspended there. You rise and cross the room, touching the wall lightly. The soil is cool but firm, its texture slightly smoother where repeated contact has polished it. Near the stove, the wall feels drier, almost chalky. Closer to the doorway, the scent deepens where cold air meets warm earth. Outside, snow continues to fall in soft sheets. The wind has quieted for now, allowing flakes to settle gently rather than drive sideways. You open the door briefly to maintain ventilation. A thin slice of bright white fills your view before you close it again. The contrast between outside and inside sharpens your awareness of scent even further. The air beyond smells clean and sharp. The air within is layered and lived in. Anthropologists examining domestic life in isolated environments have suggested that enclosed spaces amplify sensory perception. When visual stimuli diminish, smell and sound become more pronounced. You sense that truth here. The dugout may be small, but it feels complex, alive with subtle variations. You return to the stove and add a measured piece of wood. As it catches warmth, radiates outward, and the fragrance shifts again. Heated soil releases a faint sweetness. The wool blanket on the bunk carries the smoky residue of many evenings. Even the straw mattress has its own dry, grassy note beneath it all. These scents become markers of stability. They reassure you that the room remains as it should be. If something were wrong, if dampness grew too strong or smoke lingered improperly, you would detect it immediately. In this way, smell becomes a quiet guardian. There is ongoing academic discussion about how early settlers adapted psychologically to earthen living spaces, especially during prolonged winters. Some scholars argue that constant exposure to soil and confined air could feel oppressive. Others contend that familiarity bred comfort, transforming the dugout into a sanctuary rather than a burden. Sitting here amid layered scent and gentle warmth, you lean toward the latter interpretation. You settle onto the bunk once more and let the fragrance envelop you. It is no longer foreign. It belongs to you now just as much as the rhythm of shoveling snow or tending flame. Above the snow thickens, gradually adding another quiet layer to your shelter. The beams do not protest. The support post stands firm. You close your eyes briefly and focus on breath. Inhale earth and smoke. Exhale warmth into cool air. The dugout responds with its own subtle shifts, adjusting to temperature and time. Repeated snowstorms shape not only the land outside, but the interior atmosphere of this small room. They press scent deeper into fabric and memory. They blend earth and flame into a single winter signature. As evening approaches and lamplight returns, the fragrance intensifies, once more warmed and stirred by flame. You sit quietly, aware that years from now the faint smell of damp soil after rain might carry you back to this season. For now, though, you remain here surrounded by layers of scent that tell you the shelter holds, the stove burns, and the winter continues its patient work above. Sleep brings images now. Not always clear ones, not always comforting, but shaped unmistakably by the world of white pressing above you. You drift into dreams of endless fields where the horizon dissolves and reforms of walking across snow that makes no sound beneath your feet. Even in rest, the storm lingers. You wake once in the night with the sensation that the room is brighter than usual. For a moment you think dawn has come early. Then you realize the sky outside must have cleared briefly, allowing moonlight to reflect off the vast blanket of snow. The entrance tunnel glows faintly, casting a pale wash across the floor. The dugout feels almost luminous in its dim way. Accounts from harsh prairie winters sometimes mention how moonlight on deep snow could illuminate entire landscapes as if under a ghostly lantern. Even buried homes caught that reflected glow, their interiors brightening subtly despite thick walls. It must have felt surreal, this interplay of darkness and brilliance filtered through drift. You shift on the bunk and listen. The air is still for now. No wind combs the roof. No sliding drift disturbs the beams. Only the soft crackle of the stove's remaining embers and the faint settling of packed snow overhead. There is a small story recorded in a settler's recollection about a child, convinced that the world above the dugout had turned to solid ice during winter, that nothing green would ever return. It took repeated springs to convince her otherwise. Dreams in long winters can blur into waking assumptions. You close your eyes again, but the images persist. White fields, endless drifts. You imagine yourself climbing out of the entrance tunnel and walking across a surface that seems boundless. The absence of landmarks becomes a kind of quiet disorientation. Psychologists studying isolation in extreme climates have noted that repetitive sensory environments can influence dream patterns. When days are filled with similar sights and sounds, the mind continues the repetition at night. Snow becomes a backdrop not only outside but within thought itself. You roll onto your side and press your hand against the earthen wall. The cool firmness grounds you, anchoring dream to reality. The dugout is not infinite, it is contained steady. The ceiling beams remain only a few feet above. Above, another faint sound interrupts your drifting thoughts. A light sliding noise travels across the roof as a thin layer of air shifts position. You hold still, listening for any sign of strain. None follows. The support post you added earlier stands firm, sharing the load quietly. You consider how many nights like this remain. Repeated snowstorms have blurred the calendar. Yet somewhere beyond these layers, the sun still arcs across the sky, even if unseen. The knowledge steadies you. You sit up briefly and adjust the blanket, tucking it more securely around your shoulders. The air has cooled slightly during the stove's decline. You consider rising to add more wood, then decide against it. Conservation remains your constant companion. Outside, clouds begin to drift back across the moon, dimming the glow at the entrance. The room returns to deeper shadow. You feel the weight of snow above, not as threat, but as presence, a quiet mass that insulates and conceals. Some historians have suggested that prolonged winters encouraged a kind of inward turn among settlers, fostering reflection and contemplation. With fewer external distractions, attention shifted to memory and imagination. You sense that shift now, lying awake between dream and awareness. You think of summers past, of grass rippling under open sky. The contrast sharpens the present moment. Beneath layers of drift and soil, you remain steady, sheltered. Gradually, fatigue pulls you downward again. Dreams soften, images blending into indistinct shapes. The dugout hums gently with contained warmth. The roof holds. The snow continues its slow accumulation. When morning finally arrives, it does so quietly. The entrance tunnel glows faintly once more, signalling another day beneath winter's weight. You stretch and sit up, aware that even your dreams now carry traces of snow. Repeated storms shape not only the land and the shelter, but the mind itself. Yet within these shifting inner landscapes, the dugout remains your anchor, a firm earthen boundary between imagination and survival. And as you rise to greet another grey morning, you carry both the memory of moonlit drifts and the solid reassurance of packed soil at your back. Eventually your thoughts turn outward again beyond the low beams and earthen walls toward the animals that share this winter with you. Livestock do not have the luxury of burrowing fully beneath the soil. They endure the storms in barns, lean-tos or windbreaks carved from whatever materials were available before the first snowfall. You wake before dawn with a sharper edge of concern. The storm that passed in the night carried heavier gusts than usual. Snow pressed hard against the dugout door and wind roared with more urgency. You lie still for a moment, listening to the fading rush above, and imagine the barn half buried, perhaps its roof collecting drift. Agricultural records from the late 19th century indicate that livestock losses during severe winters could be devastating, especially when blizzards followed one another without thaw. Cattle and horses required not only shelter but access to feed and water, both of which became harder to secure under deep accumulation. Dugouts protected people relatively well. Animals were more exposed. You rise and move quickly, feeding the stove with efficient motions. The room warms gradually, but your focus remains beyond the walls. You pull on boots and gloves, bracing yourself for the effort of clearing the doorway once more. Snow has packed tightly against the entrance. You shovel upward with steady determination, breath forming clouds in the narrow shaft. When you finally climb out, the cold strikes sharply at your face. The wind has eased, but drifts stand taller than before. The barn lies in the direction you remember, though only its upper edge and roofline remain visible. Snow has climbed nearly halfway up its sides. You move carefully, carving a path through knee-deep powder. Each step requires effort. There is a recollection preserved in a rancher's account of tying bells to the necks of cattle during blizzard season so their location could be detected by sound when visibility dropped. The gentle ringing served as both guide and reassurance. You pause and listen now, but hear only the faint shifting of snow. Reaching the barn, you brush accumulation from the door and force it open. Inside, the air feels slightly warmer than outside, but far colder than the dugout. The animals shift uneasily, their breath rising in thick clouds. You check feed, ensuring hay remains accessible and not frozen into a solid mass. Some researchers examining winter mortality among frontier herds have pointed out that repeated storms were more lethal than a single severe event. With each snowfall, access to grazing diminished and stored feed dwindled. Without careful rationing and timely clearing, losses mounted quickly. You measure hay with the same caution you apply to flour. You refill water troughs as best you can, breaking thin layers of ice that have formed overnight. The sound of cracking ice echoes faintly within the barn. The animals settle somewhat as you move among them, your presence familiar. Outside again you glance toward the dugout, its chimney pipe a thin dark line against white. The journey between shelter and barn is short in distance but long in effort. Snow will reclaim your path within hours. Some historians have debated whether smaller homesteads were more vulnerable during extended winters because limited manpower constrained daily labour. Larger operations had more hands to clear drifts and tend stock. Yet smaller households often developed tighter routines, adapting swiftly to changing conditions. The question remains complex. You return to the dugout, boots heavy with snow, cheeks flushed from cold. Inside, warmth greets you like a quiet reward. You close the door firmly and brush ice from your coat before it can melt onto the floor. The contrast between spaces feels stark. The barn is exposed and drafty. The dugout is contained and insulated. Yet both are essential. Survival here depends on more than one structure holding firm. You sit near the stove, hands extended toward its heat, and think of the animals settling into their own uneasy rest. The storms do not distinguish between human and beast. They test all equally. In county histories of particularly brutal winters, Livestock losses are often recorded in sobering numbers, while stories of dugouts enduring under deep drift appear almost secondary. Yet those earthen shelters made the tending of animals possible. Without them, the cold would have claimed more than barns. As evening approaches, wind resumes lightly brushing snow across the surface again. Your cleared path to the barn begins to soften. Tomorrow you will carve it anew. You lie back on the bunk later that night, aware that your world extends beyond these walls even when hidden. Beneath layers of snow, beneath low beams and reinforced posts, you rest. Above ground, animals shift in their stalls, waiting for morning feed. Repeated snowstorms bind all of you into a shared endurance. And as you close your eyes, you carry both the warmth of the dugout and the responsibility that waits just beyond its buried door. By now you have accepted that nothing you shape outside will remain for long. Every path you carve through the snow, every careful set of footprints between dugout and barn disappears beneath the next sweep of wind or fall of flakes. The prairie refuses to hold your marks. You step out after another restless night and pause at the top of the entrance tunnel. The surface stretches smooth and pale, as if untouched by human presence. Yesterday's narrow trench to the barn is gone. In its place lies a gently rippled drift that offers no memory of your effort. Weather chronicles from the plains often describe how repeated blizzards erase trails so completely that settlers relied on fence lines, telegraph poles, or sheer intuition to navigate between structures. When those markers were buried, disorientation became a genuine threat. The land's familiarity vanished under uniform white. You descend into the snow, carefully testing each step. Without visible reference points, distance feels altered. The barn, though only a short walk away, appears to float in the whiteness. Its roofline barely breaks the surface now. There is a small anecdote recorded in a regional history about a farmer who planted tall saplings along the route between house and well specifically to serve as winter guides. In heavy snowfall, only the upper branches remained visible, marking a faint corridor through the drift. The idea strikes you as both simple and ingenious. You carve a new path today, lifting snow aside with deliberate motions. The work warms you quickly. Your breath rises in thick plumes and sweat prickles at your collar despite the cold. You pause often, not from weakness, but to conserve strength. Overexertion in freezing air can be as dangerous as inaction. By the time you reach the barn and complete your checks, the sky has begun to thicken again with gathering cloud. Another wave may be forming. You glance back toward the dugout and note how small it appears, nearly swallowed by drift except for its chimney. Some historians examining the psychological impact of winter isolation have pointed to this daily erasure as a powerful metaphor. Each morning demanded fresh effort. Nothing done the previous day could be relied upon to remain. Yet the repetition fostered resilience. The act of remaking the path became proof of persistence. You return inside the dugout and close the door, brushing snow from your coat. The room greets you with its steady warmth and familiar scent. The contrast feels sharper today. Outside a blank and shifting surface, inside a stable and contained space. You set down the shovel and flex your fingers near the stove. Snow melts from your boots, dripping onto the sloped floor before you wipe it away. The room holds firm, untroubled by the disappearance of your tracks. Later, as afternoon light filters weakly through the entrance tunnel, you glance toward it and imagine the path outside already softening under fresh flakes. The effort of carving it feels both necessary and fleeting. Meteorological data from severe winter seasons show how wind speed combined with loose surface snow can obliterate visible traces within minutes. It is not merely falling snow that erases paths, but movement across it. The prairie reshapes itself constantly under that influence. You sit back against the earthen wall and consider the rhythm of it all. Dig clear, tend rest. So, the storm removes. You restore. The next gust removes again. There is a quiet humility in that cycle. In the dim light of the dugout, you trace a small line in the dirt floor with your fingertip. The mark remains, at least for now. Unlike the path outside, it is sheltered from wind. You smooth it away, almost immediately aware of the contrast. As evening approaches, snow begins to fall once more, fine and steady. You can hear its faint whisper against the roof. Tomorrow the landscape will be new again, blank and unmarked. You rise and adjust the support post slightly, ensuring it remains snug beneath the beam. The small act feels grounding. There are things you can control inside these walls. Outside control is temporary at best. When you lie down that night, you think not of the vanished footprints, but of the act of making them. Each morning's labour affirms your presence on the land, even if the land does not preserve the evidence. Above, snow settles over the drifted surface, smoothing it into another unbroken field. Below you rest beneath earth and timber, knowing that at dawn you will carve your way through white once more. Repeated snowstorms may erase your steps, but they cannot erase the will that made them. After enough days beneath snow and sky, the colour of ash, you begin to understand that warmth is not only physical, it is ritual, it is repetition. It is the small comfort you create deliberately when the outside world offers none. You wake to another muted morning and decide almost without thinking to change something small. Not the structure, not the supplies, but the arrangement of your day. The stove is lit as usual, the doorway cleared with steady effort. Yet instead of sitting immediately on the bunk, you drag the small crate closer to the entrance tunnel where faint light seeps through. The shift is subtle, but it alters the atmosphere. Frontier letters sometimes describe how families develop tiny traditions during prolonged winters. A special meal, saved for the coldest night. A song sung only when the wind was at its loudest. These customs did not change the weather. They changed the mood. You retrieve a small scrap of cloth from your bundle, something bright that has not yet been dulled by smoke. You hang it from a peg near the table. The colour, even in dim light, draws the eye. It feels almost defiant against the brown of earth and grey of shadow. There is a curious detail found in a settler's recollection about people placing bits of ribbon or dried flowers along interior walls in winter, not because such decorations were necessary, but because they reminded them of seasons beyond snow. It was a quiet insistence that winter did not own the entire year. You sit near the stove and warm your hands, glancing occasionally at the cloth. The room feels marginally less confined. The lamp, when lit, will catch that scrap of colour and amplify it slightly. Anthropologists who study resilience in harsh climates often emphasise the role of symbolic acts. Small gestures of order or beauty reinforce a sense of agency when external conditions feel uncontrollable. Hanging a piece of cloth, rearranging a stool, saving a spoonful of sugar for a later treat. These are not trivial. They are anchors. Outside wind stirs once more, though less violently than before. Snow drifts in fine patterns across the buried prairie. You open the door briefly and notice how the drift has reshaped again, smoothing edges you carved yesterday. You close it with a calm you did not possess at the beginning of the season. Inside, you decide to brew coffee if any remains. The tin is light, nearly empty, but there is enough for a modest pot. The smell that rises as water heats and ground steep is rich and almost startling in its intensity. It cuts through the earthiness of the room, sharp and invigorating. Historical trade records from the plains show that coffee was one of the most sought-after goods in frontier stores, sometimes more valued than sugar. It was rationed carefully during winter, not only for its warmth, but for the lift it provided in long stretches of monotony. You sip slowly, letting the heat spread from tongue to chest. You carry the cup toward the bunk and sit, savouring each swallow. Outside, the storm resumes, lightly tapping faintly against the snow-packed roof. Inside, the stove crackles and the lamp flickers. There has been discussion among historians about whether these small comforts truly offset the strain of isolation or merely distracted from it temporarily. The evidence suggests both. Comfort did not eliminate hardship, it made it bearable. You run your fingers along the earthen wall and feel its cool steadiness. The dugout has not changed dramatically since the first storm. Yet you respond differently now. Less surprise, more rhythm. Later, as evening settles, you gather blankets and shake them gently, releasing dust and redistributing warmth. The small scrap of cloth on the peg glows faintly in lamplight, a modest splash of colour in an otherwise subdued room. Repeated snowstorms press against the roof, but inside you shape your own climate in small ways. A cup of coffee, a brighter corner, a rearranged stool. These are not grand gestures, they are quiet affirmations that you are more than a figure enduring weather. You lie down at last, pulling the blanket to your chin. The stove hums softly, the lamp dims, the cloth sways slightly in a draught you will fix tomorrow. Above, snow continues its patient descent. Below, within these walls of packed earth, you hold on to small rituals that warm more than your hands. And as sleep approaches once more, you recognize that survival in repeated snowstorms depends not only on timber and soil, but on the tiny sparks of comfort you choose to kindle inside. The sack of flour feels lighter in your hands now. Not alarmingly so, but noticeably. When you lift it from the corner and pour a careful measure into your cup, you can sense how the weight has shifted over these repeated days of snow. The storm outside may be relentless, but it is your provisions that quietly set the rhythm of concern. You sit near the stove and sift the flour through your fingers, watching it fall in a pale stream into the bowl. The movement is slow, deliberate. Nothing is spilled, nothing wasted. You add water sparingly and begin to knead, feeling the dough resist and yield beneath your palms. Agricultural reports from settlement years often emphasize how winter planning began months in advance. Wheat harvests were calculated not only for market but for survival. Flour was milled and stored with the understanding that storms might isolate families far longer than expected. A poor harvest combined with a severe winter could spell genuine hardship. You glance toward the crock of the beans and the barrel of salted meat. Each item has been stretched carefully. Portions have grown slightly smaller without fanfare. Hunger has not become urgent, but you sense the narrowing margin. There is an understated anecdote recorded in a frontier letter about a woman who mixed ground corn cobs into flour during a particularly lean winter to extend her bread. The texture was coarse and far from ideal, yet it sustained her family until Thor. The ingenuity was born not of preference but of necessity. You consider your own supplies and feel a quiet gratitude that you have not yet reached such measures. Outside, snow falls in fine threads, less dramatic than earlier storms but persistent. The wind is gentle for now, though drifts remain high against the exposed wall. You open the door briefly to maintain airflow and note how the tunnel narrows once more. Clearing it has become almost reflexive. Researchers studying food security in frontier communities often point out that repeated storms tested not only physical stores but emotional reserves. The act of rationing demanded discipline and foresight. Families learned to balance immediate comfort against uncertain duration. As you divide the dough into modest rounds, you practice that same restraint. You place the bread on the heated surface of the stove and watch it cook. The smell rises warmly, momentarily filling the dugout with a sense of abundance that belies the measured portions. You sit and think about the animals again. Haystacks shrink gradually in the barn. Water troughs require more frequent breaking as temperatures fluctuate. Every living thing beneath this sky depends on careful management. Scholars examining homestead economies have long debated whether isolated households were more vulnerable than those clustered near towns during prolonged winters. Some argue that proximity to trade routes offered greater security. Others suggest that remote families accustomed to self-reliance were often better prepared for extended isolation. The evidence varies, shaped by geography and individual foresight. You turn the bread once, watching the underside brown gently. The stove hums with contained heat. The dugout feels steady, though dim. After eating, you count again, not obsessively, but attentively. Enough flour for several more days at current portions. Been sufficient if stretched. Salted pork to be used sparingly, coffee nearly gone. You calculate without writing anything down, committing the numbers to memory. Outside, the snow thickens slightly. Another wave may be approaching. You brace yourself for more days beneath grey sky. Yet even as supplies diminish, you notice something else. Your anxiety does not rise proportionally. Instead, it settles into a steady awareness. You know what you have. You know what you need. Panic would waste energy. Historical accounts from especially severe winters sometimes describe neighbours sharing small amounts of food once roads reopened, redistributing what remained to those most affected. The knowledge that community could reassemble after isolation offered reassurance during the bleakest weeks. You carry that possibility in the back of your mind. For now, you remain within earthen walls beneath a roof weighted with snow. The flour sack rests in its corner lighter, but not empty. The stove continues its patient work. As evening draws near, you wrap the remaining bread carefully and set it aside for tomorrow. The lamp is lit. Shadows stretch softly along the walls. Repeated snowstorms narrow the world to what fits within these walls. Food, warmth, breath. Yet within that narrow frame you continue to adapt to measure to endure. You lie down once more, aware of the thinning supplies, but not undone by them. Above, snow settles quietly. Below you conserve what remains. Winter may test your stores, but you answer it with caution rather than fear. And as sleep approaches again, you trust that careful hands and steady thought will carry you through until the sky finally loosens its grip. Illness feels closer in winter, not because it arrives more dramatically, but because there is nowhere to send it away. In summer, a cough drifts out into open air. In a dugout during repeated snowstorms, every sound lingers within earthen walls. You wake to the faint scratch in your throat that has been building for a day or two. It is small, almost insignificant, yet in this confined space it draws your attention immediately. The air inside remains steady, warmed gently by the stove, but dryness and smoke can irritate lungs over time. Medical reports from frontier settlements often noted that winter illnesses spread quickly within households, especially when families remained indoors for extended stretches. Limited ventilation and close quarters created ideal conditions for coughs and fevers to circulate. Yet access to physicians was sparse, particularly during storms when travel was impossible. You sit up slowly and take a measured breath. The scratch persists but does not deepen. You move to the stove and add a small piece of wood, coaxing a brighter flame. Warmth will help, so will moisture. There is a small mention in a pioneer diary of placing a kettle of water near the stove, not only for cooking, but to release steam into the air during dry winter nights. The gentle humidity eased breathing and softened persistent coughs. You retrieve a small pot, fill it carefully from stored water, and set it near the heat. Soon a faint mist begins to rise. Outside, snow continues to fall, though less heavily than in previous days. The wind has quieted again. The entrance tunnel glows faintly with diffused light. You open the door briefly to allow fresh air to circulate, then close it before the room chills too far. Researchers examining health outcomes in isolated homesteads have debated how much earthen dwellings helped or hindered winter well-being. Some suggest that the stable temperatures inside dugouts reduced exposure to extreme cold. Others note that dampness and smoke could aggravate respiratory conditions. As you inhale the steam rising from the kettle, you feel the balance of those factors in real time. You wrap a blanket around your shoulders and sit near the stove, letting warmth settle into your chest. The dugout smells of heated earth and faint moisture. The scent is comforting, though heavier today as steam mingles with smoke. A curious anecdote appears in a regional history about settlers brewing teas from dried prairie plants when coughs set in, using wild mint or sage gathered during warmer months. Whether these remedies cured anything remains uncertain, but the act of preparing them provided comfort and focus. You search your small bundle and find a pinch of dried leaves saved from autumn. Steeping them in hot water, you watch the liquid darken slowly. You sip carefully, letting the warmth travel downward. The taste is mild but soothing. Outside, the snow resumes in a thin, steady pattern. Illness during repeated snowstorms carries a particular weight because options narrow. Travel to seek assistance may be impossible for days. You rely on observation and patience instead. Is the cough deepening or easing? Is fever rising or holding steady? Each sign matters. Historical mortality records from severe winters show that respiratory ailments could claim lives when compounded by cold and isolation. Yet they also reveal many cases where families nursed one another through weeks of discomfort with limited resources. Resilience often depended on attentive care rather than advanced medicine. You lean back against the wall and close your eyes briefly. The steam from the kettle softens the air. Your breathing feels easier now, the scratch in your throat less sharp. The dugout remains steady, the beams hold, the support post stands firm. Outside the storm persists, but without violent gusts. As afternoon fades, you rest more than usual, conserving energy. The stove hums gently, the small pot continues to release faint vapour. You think of how many winters before this one have pressed families into similar stillness, listening to coughs echo in confined spaces, tending small fires and small remedies. The repetition stretches backward through time. When night falls, you lower the lamp wick and settle onto the bunk blanket drawn close. The air feels slightly more humid, less biting. Your throat no longer demands attention with each swallow. Repeated snowstorms test more than structure and supply. They test the body, quietly asking it to endure confinement and cold without surrender. Tonight you answer that test with warmth, steam and rest. Above, snow layers itself patiently over the roof. Below, breath steadies within earthen walls. And as sleep approaches, you trust that careful tending of fire and of self will see you through another grey dawn. Letters sit in a small bundle near the table, tied with twine that has grown slightly stiff in the cool air. Some were written before the storms began, others drafted in spare moments between digging and tending the stove. None have been sent. The roads are buried, the nearest town unreachable for now. Words wait patiently like you. You untie the bundle and unfold the top sheet carefully. The paper has absorbed the faint scent of smoke, the edges softened from repeated handling. The ink, slightly faded, carries thoughts meant for someone beyond the horizon. Postal records from frontier regions show that winter delivery could be irregular at best. Heavy snowfall and drifting often halted mail routes for weeks. In some cases, accumulated letters were delivered all at once when roads reopened, bringing a flood of delayed news. Until then, communication existed only in anticipation. You sit near the stove and read a paragraph aloud, softly testing how it sounds in the confined space. The words feel different, spoken beneath earthen beams. They echo faintly against the walls, then settle into silence. There is a small note preserved in a pioneer account about people writing letters even when they knew they could not be sent immediately. The act itself offered relief, a sense of connection maintained despite isolation. Putting thoughts to paper created a bridge even if it remained suspended over snow for months. You smooth the page and consider adding another line. You describe the height of the drifts, the way the dugout has grown dimmer as snow presses against the front wall. You mention the animals, the careful rationing, the small comforts like coffee and dried herbs. You do not dramatize, you simply record. Historians studying frontier correspondence often remark on how understated many winter letters were. Hardship was acknowledged but rarely embellished. The tone remained practical, steady, sometimes even light. Perhaps exaggeration felt wasteful when so much effort was spent on survival. You fold the paper and return it to the bundle. The letters represent a world beyond these walls, a reminder that this season, however consuming, is not the entirety of existence. Outside, snow resumes lightly, tapping faintly against the drifted roof. The wind is calm for now. You open the door briefly and glance at the blank surface of the prairie. No tracks lead away, no wagon ruts cut through white. The path to town exists only in memory. Scholars have debated whether prolonged communication delays increased feelings of isolation among settlers, or whether expectation of delay tempered disappointment. Some argue that knowing winter would disrupt mail routes made silence less alarming. Others suggest that uncertainty weighed heavily nonetheless. As you stand at the doorway, you feel both patience and longing. You close the door and return inside, placing the letters back in their corner. The stove hums gently, the lamp casts a soft circle of light across the table. In the quiet of the dugout, you imagine the moment when the snow finally loosens its hold. The first trip to town. The exchange of bundled letters. News received all at once, layered like the storms themselves. For now, though, words remain suspended in time. They wait as you wait. You sit back on the bunk and trace a finger along the edge of the table. The wood is worn smooth in places from repeated touch. The room feels smaller today, perhaps because your thoughts have travelled outward beyond it. Repeated snowstorms confine movement but not memory or intention. Letters bridge distance even when roads vanish. They carry fragments of warmth across seasons. As evening settles and the lamp dims, you picture someone far away unfolding your page months from now. Reading about this winter long after the drifts have melted, a thought steadies you. Above, snow continues to accumulate in quiet layers. Below, within earthen walls, ink dries on paper that will one day leave this room. And as you lie down beneath timber and soil once more, you hold on to the promise that isolation is temporary, that roads reappear, and that words eventually find their way. The thaw does not arrive all at once, it whispers first. A faint drip from the edge of the entrance tunnel. A subtle softening in the snow pressed against the exposed wall. You notice it one morning when the air inside feels slightly different, less sharp at the edges. You push open the door and pause. The surface of the drift glistens faintly under a weak sun, filtered through thinning clouds. The snow has not vanished, but it has changed character. Where once it was powder and hard-packed crust, now it yields slightly beneath your boot. Climatological records from the Great Plains show that winter often loosened its grip in cycles rather than in a single dramatic melt. A few days of milder temperatures could soften deep drifts, only for another cold front to refreeze everything solid again. These alternating patterns of thaw and freeze placed additional stress on structures already burdened by weeks of accumulation. You step back into the dugout and glance upward at the beams. Moisture will follow a warmth. Snow that melts during the day may seep downward and refreeze at night, expanding in cracks and testing timber and soil alike. The shift demands renewed attention. There is a modest recollection in a prairie memoir about children delighting in the first audible drip from the roof edge, racing to place cups beneath it as if collecting treasure. For them, each drop signaled the promise of spring. For adults, each drop carried calculation. You fetch the small rag again and inspect the walls near the doorway. Dampness has increased slightly, darkening the soil in irregular patches. The stove becomes your ally once more. You feed it carefully, increasing heat just enough to counteract moisture without wasting fuel. Researchers who study earthen architecture frequently emphasize that freeze-thaw cycles are among the most damaging forces acting on soil-based structures. Water expands as it freezes, widening small fissures. Repeated over time, this process can weaken walls or loosen roof coverings. Your dugout, buried under layers of snow, must endure that quiet strain. You walk to the support post added earlier and press your palm against it. The timber feels solid, though faintly cooler near its base where dampness gathers. You adjust it slightly, ensuring firm contact with the beam above. Outside, water trickles faintly along the surface of the drift before disappearing into lower layers. The sound is delicate, almost musical after weeks of muffled silence. There is ongoing scholarly discussion about how settlers adapted their maintenance routines during late winter transitions. Some argue that experience taught families to anticipate structural shifts at the first sign of thaw, reinforcing vulnerable areas in advance. Others suggest that many were caught off guard by sudden collapses triggered by refreezing meltwater. The truth likely varied by region and skill. You close the door and return to the warmth of the stove. The dugout smells slightly richer today, damp, earth warmed by flame. The scent signals both change and resilience. As afternoon passes, sunlight strengthens briefly, casting a brighter glow through the entrance tunnel than you have seen in weeks. You sit near that light and let it rest on your face. It does not erase the snow, it does not melt the drifts entirely, but it hints at transformation. By evening, temperatures drop again. The faint dampness along the wall firms under cooling air. The drip outside slows, then stops, freeze returns. The surface that softened by day hardens once more. You lie on the bunk and listen to the subtle crackle of ice forming within snow layers above. The roof responds with small adjustments as weight redistributes. Repeated snowstorms have tested endurance. Now thaw and freeze introduce a new rhythm, quieter but equally demanding. You understand that winter is not finished simply because the air softens for a few hours. Yet hope threads through the uncertainty. Each brief thaw shortens the season's hold, even if only slightly. You close your eyes and picture the drifts shrinking, gradually revealing fence posts, then patches of grass. It will not happen tomorrow, but it will happen. Above, snow shifts from solid to liquid and back again. Below, beneath earth and timber, you remain steady, adjusting heat and watching walls with encounter care. Winter's grip loosens by degrees, and as you drift towards sleep, you sense that even in its slow retreat, it continues to shape your shelter and your patience alike. The sounds at night have changed again. They are sharper now, less muffled than during the height of the storms. Snow still covers the roof in thick layers, but the repeated thaw and freeze has altered its texture. What was once soft and absorptive has hardened, in places creating surfaces that shift more abruptly. You wake to a distinct crack from above, not violent bumsant, but crisp. For a moment you lie still, counting heartbeats. Then a faint sliding noise follows, ending in a muted thud, as a sheet of crusted snow settles lower along the slope of the buried roof. Weather journals from prairie settlements sometimes describe late winter nights when temperature drops suddenly, after a mild afternoon, causing surface melt to refreeze quickly. The result was a brittle crust that could fracture under its own weight, sending small avalanches of snow sliding down embankments and over roofs. Dugouts experienced these shifts more subtly, but not silently. You sit up and listen again. The support post stands firm in the dim light. The beams hold steady. The room feels unchanged despite the sharper sounds above. There is a brief anecdote found in a regional chronicle about settlers mistaking the cracking of refreezing snow for distant gunfire, so unfamiliar were they with that particular sound during their first winters on the plains. Over time, they learn to recognize the difference. You smile faintly at the thought. Tonight you recognize the sound immediately. You rise and stir the stove, adding a modest piece of wood to maintain warmth. The iron responds with its familiar tick and glow. The air inside the dugout remains steady, though slightly cooler than earlier in the season. Outside, the wind brushes across the hardened surface, producing a faint scraping tone as snow crystals move against one another. It is not the soft whisper of fresh flakes, but a dry hiss, more distinct. Researchers who examine acoustic changes in winter landscapes note that as snow compacts and refreezes, its ability to absorb sound diminishes. Surfaces reflect more noise, altering the auditory character of the environment. Even beneath earth and timber, you sense that difference. You open the door briefly and peer out into the dim early morning. The drift near the entrance shows subtle ridges where meltwater once ran before freezing again. The surface glitters faintly under pale light. Closing the door, you brush loose frost from your gloves. Inside, the dugout feels slightly more spacious than during peak accumulation, though the walls have not moved. Perhaps it is the sound that changes perception. Sharper noises create an impression of greater distance. You sit near the table and run your hand along the wood grain. The room remains stable, yet alive with small adjustments. Another crack sounds above, followed by a gentle settling. You glance upward, then relax as the beams remain unwavering. There has been scholarly discussion about how transitional seasons pose distinct risks to earthen dwellings. While deep snow-insulated, effectively partial melt could expose sections of roof, unevenly redistributing weight unpredictably. Vigilance during these weeks was often emphasized in settlement manuals. You keep that caution in mind as you monitor each new sound. Later, as daylight strengthens slightly, you step outside to inspect the roofline from the entrance. Sections of snow have slid lower, forming thicker banks along the sides. The chimney pipe stands free of obstruction smoke drifting upward without hindrance. You consider whether to climb and redistribute some of the hardened crust, but decide conditions are not yet safe. The surface is slick and another freeze may occur by nightfall. Patience remains your ally. Back inside, you close the door and return to the warmth. The stove hums gently. The support post stands quiet in its role. Repeated snowstorms brought muffled silence. The Thor has introduced sharper notes. Each phase of winter has its own soundtrack, and you have learned to read it like a language. As evening approaches, the air cools again. The hardened crust above tightens, producing faint snaps as temperature drops. You lie down and listen with practiced calm. The sounds no longer startle you, they inform you. Above, snow shifts and freezes. Below, beneath layers of earth, you remain steady, attuned to every creak and crack. And as sleep gathers once more, you understand that even the noises of winter's slow retreat are part of the same long conversation between storm and shelter. Memory begins to feel warmer than the room itself. Not because the dugout has grown colder, but because your thoughts travel more often to sunlight than to snow. You sit near the entrance tunnel one afternoon watching a slightly brighter glow filter through thinning cloud, and you find yourself recalling the exact shade of green that once covered the prairie. It has been weeks since you saw open grass, weeks since wind carried the scent of soil not frozen beneath drift. The land above you remains largely concealed, yet in your mind it rises vividly. Personal accounts from settlers often describe how winter sharpened recollections of summer. The contrast heightened appreciation. Fields remembered in detail, streams imagined in motion. Even mundane chores like mending fences took on a kind of nostalgic glow when viewed from beneath snow. You close your eyes and picture the slope where wildflowers bloomed last season. You remember how the sun set behind distant hills, casting long shadows across open ground. The dugout, now buried under white, once stood plainly against brown earth and blue sky. There is a gentle story found in a prairie diary about a family who painted a small patch of their interior wall sky blue during winter simply to remind themselves of the colour above. The paint was imperfect, uneven against packed soil, yet it became a focal point of conversation until spring returned. You glance at the earthen wall beside you and imagine a faint wash of colour there. Outside, the snow has receded slightly from the highest points, revealing hints of fence posts and uneven ground. The changes are subtle but unmistakable. The surface no longer appears entirely uniform. Scholars who analyse seasonal adaptation in frontier communities have suggested that hope often grew strongest just before visible change. The anticipation of Thor carried psychological weight, sustaining patience through lingering cold. You feel that quiet anticipation now as you watch light strengthen incrementally each day. You stand and stretch, feeling stiffness ease from your limbs. The dugout still holds its shape. The beams remain firm. The support post stands steady. Yet the atmosphere feels lighter, as if the earth itself senses the shift. You open the door and step outside carefully. Snow remains deep, but patches along the southern slope of the drift show faint darkening where melt has begun in earnest. The barn roof is more visible now, its outline clearer against the pale ground. You draw a slow breath of the outside air. It smells different than it did during peak storm. Less sharp, slightly damp, a hint of soil beneath the coal. Climatological studies of late winter patterns indicate that once days lengthen sufficiently, solar radiation begins to outpace overnight freeze even if temperatures remain low. That subtle balance shift initiates gradual retreat of snow cover. You feel that change not through numbers but through light and scent. Returning inside, you close the door gently. The dugout greets you with its familiar warmth, though it no longer feels as enclosed as before. Perhaps the mind expands when it senses approaching openness. You sit on the bunk and trace patterns in the dirt floor with your finger, not as a measure of time but as a quiet meditation. Outside, snow may linger for weeks yet, but the season has begun to turn. Historians have debated whether the emotional toll of winter was relieved more by the first thaw or by the first visible green shoot. Some argue that meltwater and longer days lifted spirits. Others contend that only tangible signs of growth restored full optimism. As you sit beneath earth and timber, you suspect both play a role. Evening arrives with a softer tone. The lamp's glow feels warmer against walls that no longer seem quite so close. The stove hums gently. You lie down and close your eyes, not to dream of endless white, but to imagine the sound of wind moving freely across open grass. The memory carries warmth with it. Above, snow thins, gradually surrendering inch by inch. Below, you remain steady, aware that soon the dugout will emerge from concealment. Repeated snowstorms shape this season, but they do not define it entirely. As you drift towards sleep, you hold on to the certainty that beneath every drift lies earth waiting for sun. And in that quiet assurance, the dugout feels less like a burrow and more like a threshold. When the storms begin to loosen their grip, stories surface. not all at once and not always spoken aloud, but carried in glances and half-remembered remarks. You sit near the stove one evening listening to the faint drip outside, and you recall winters past that were said to test every shelter on the prairie. County archives from the late 19th century preserve accounts of seasons so severe that livestock perished in staggering numbers and entire settlements were cut off for weeks. In some regions, snow accumulated in successive waves until homes appeared as small humps in a white expanse. Dugouts set low into the ground often endured more steadily than frame houses battered by wind. You picture those earlier winters, imagining families much like yours sitting beneath earth and timber while storms raged above. The dugout becomes part of a lineage, a quiet tradition of adaptation passed from one season to the next. There is a memorable anecdote recorded in a regional history about a homesteader who emerged after a brutal storm to find that drifting snow had formed a perfect arch over his dugout entrance, creating a natural tunnel of ice and powder. Rather than panic, he marvelled at the formation before carefully reinforcing the sides. The moment blended danger with wonder. Outside, the snow now recedes in uneven patches, revealing dark soil beneath. The landscape looks scarred and reshaped, but alive. You step out briefly and notice how fence posts stand crooked where drifts once pressed against them. The barn roof is mostly visible again. Scholarly discussion about frontier resilience often centres on whether survival depended more on individual ingenuity or communal knowledge shared over time. Some argue that practical skills passed down through neighbours and relatives made the difference. Others emphasise personal vigilance and adaptability. As you stand in the thinning snow, you sense that both forces intertwine. You return inside and glance around the dugout. The support post you added stands as a small testament to attentiveness. The walls show faint marks where dampness once crept. The floor bears subtle scuffs from countless steps between bunk and stove. Each detail tells part of the season's story. It has been suggested in historical analyses that communities often transform severe winters into collective memory, recounting them at gatherings long after Thor. The retelling turned hardship into shared narrative. What felt overwhelming in the moment became a story of endurance. You sit near the table and imagine such a gathering. Neighbours describing how high the drifts climbed against their walls. Laughter at the memory of digging tunnels through snow. Comparisons of whose barn roof sagged most before reinforcement. The dugout, once merely a practical solution to scarce lumber and harsh wind, becomes symbolic in these recollections. It represents adaptation rather than deprivation, earth used wisely, shelter shaped by necessity. Outside, the last heavy bank of snow near the entrance shrinks further under afternoon light. A trickle of meltwater runs briefly before disappearing into soil. The air smells faintly of thawed ground. Researchers studying oral history traditions on the plains have noted that extreme winters often became reference points in conversation. People spoke of events as happening before or after the great storm of a particular year. The season imprinted itself on collective memory. You lie back on the bunk and look at the ceiling beams, now less burdened by snow than they were weeks ago. They held firm. The walls endured. Repeated snowstorms tested not only timber and earth, but patience and foresight. Now, as the landscape re-emerges, the dugout stands as quiet evidence of that endurance. The wind brushes gently across partially exposed ground. The sky shows faint hints of blue between retreating clouds. And as you close your eyes for the evening, you understand that this winter will become a story as well. One told in calmer seasons, perhaps with a touch of humour. A memory of being buried beneath snow yet held safely by the earth itself. One morning you wake and the light is different. Not merely brighter but sharper. It spills down the entrance tunnel with a clarity you have not seen in weeks, striking the dirt floor in a clean, defined shape. You sit up slowly, almost cautious, as if sudden brightness might be a trick. The stove has burned low, the air is cool but not biting. You swing your legs over the side of the bunk and walk toward the door, heart beating a little faster than usual. When you press against the wood this time, it moves easily. No heavy resistance, no packed wall of drift. You step upward through the tunnel and emerge into a world that feels almost startling. The sky is blue, not a pale suggestion of it, but a clear, open expanse stretching unbroken above the prairie. Snow still blankets the ground, but it lies lower now, uneven and pitted where melt has begun. Fence posts stand visible. The barn roof gleams in sunlight. Meteorological summaries from severe winter seasons often note that the first sustained clear day after repeated storms could feel transformative even if temperatures remained cold. The absence of wind and cloud shifted perception dramatically. It was not the end of winter, but it was a turning point. You stand there longer than necessary, letting sunlight rest on your face. It reflects fiercely off the snow, forcing you to squint. The air smells cleaner, tinged faintly with damp soil beneath the thawing surface. There is a small recollection preserved in a settler's memoir about someone who wept quietly at the sight of blue sky after weeks of grey confinement. Not from weakness, but from relief. The sudden return of colour and depth overwhelmed senses dulled by monotony. You understand how that could happen. You walk slowly towards the barn along a path that now requires less digging. The surface crunches beneath your boots rather than swallowing them. Each step feels lighter. Inside the barn, animals shift more energetically, perhaps sensing change as well. Sunlight filters through small gaps, illuminating dust motes in the air. You check feed and water with a steadier mind. The urgency of repeated storms has softened. Some historians have argued that clear days following severe weather often prompted bursts of activity among settlers. Repairs long postponed were addressed. Neighbours ventured out cautiously to check on one another. The landscape, though still winter-bound, invited movement again. You return to the dugout and pause at its entrance, looking at it from a slight distance. What was once nearly invisible beneath drift now emerges as a defined shape in the earth. The chimney pipe stands straight against blue sky. The front wall is exposed again. Inside the room feels brighter even without the lamp. Light reaches further across the floor. Shadows retreat from corners. The support post, once a precaution against crushing weight, now seems almost decorative. There has been discussion among scholars about whether dugouts were ultimately seen by their occupants as temporary compromises or enduring homes. Clear days like this might have sharpened that question. With sky open and horizon visible again, the desire for space beyond earth walls could resurface strongly. You sit on the bunk and let sunlight fall across the straw mattress. Dust particles shimmer in the beam. The room no longer feels as confined as it did during peak accumulation. Outside, snow will not vanish overnight. Always. More cold nights may come. Another storm could sweep across the prairie before true spring arrives. Yet something fundamental has shifted. The sense of endless repetition has broken. You step outside once more and turn slowly, taking in the breadth of land revealed. Drifts remain in hollows, but higher ground shows dark patches where soil reclaims itself. The wind is gentle, the sky vast. Repeated snowstorms buried your shelter and erased your tracks. Now the prairie returns, marked with signs of endurance rather than concealment. You descend back into the dugout with a different posture. Not crouched under weight, but stepping into a space that served its purpose well. Earth and timber carried you through relentless weeks. As evening approaches, the lamp remains unlit longer than usual. Natural light lingers, stretching the day. You sit quietly aware that the season has turned. Above, blue sky fades into twilight without threat of immediate storm. Below, within earthen walls, you rest not in confinement but in gratitude. The dugout no longer feels like a burrow beneath an endless white sea. It feels like a foundation from which you will soon step fully back into open land. You wake before sunrise on a morning that feels almost ordinary. The air inside the dugout is cool but gentle. The stove has burned down to faint embers, and when you sit up you do so without the familiar weight of apprehension. No urgent need to listen for roof strain. No immediate calculation of drifting snow against the door. You walk toward the entrance and push it open easily. The tunnel is shallow now, little more than a step up to ground level. Outside, the prairie stretches wide beneath a pale gold dawn. Snow remains in patches, but the earth shows through, in broad strokes of brown and muted green. The barn stands clear. Fence lines trace visible paths across the land. The chimney pipe above your dugout rises clean against a sky that promises neither storm nor sudden freeze. Climatologists who have analysed historical winter patterns on the plains often note that the final retreat of repeated snowstorms tends to be uneven, with brief setbacks before full thaw. Yet the psychological shift occurs the moment the sky opens reliably and the drifts stop rebuilding overnight. That moment has arrived. You stand in the open air and take a long breath. It smells of damp soil and distant grass, not of frozen white. The land feels spacious again. There is a gentle story preserved in a settler's reminiscence about the first time a family sat on the roof of their dugout after a long winter, not to redistribute snow, but simply to feel the sun without layers of wool between skin and sky. The roof that once bore heavy drift became a place of rest and quiet celebration. You glance upward and imagine climbing there yourself. You step back inside and look around the dugout with new eyes. The support post remains where you placed it, a reminder of vigilance during peak storm. The walls show faint discolorations where moisture once crept. The floor bears marks of countless crossings from bunk to stove to door. Historians have often reflected on whether dugouts were seen as humble compromises or ingenious solutions. In seasons of relentless wind and repeated snow, their value is undeniable. In spring, when sunlight floods open land, they might feel smaller than before. Both impressions can be true at once. You sit on the bunk and let light reach deeper into the room. No lamp is needed. The earth walls glow softly in natural brightness. The scent inside has shifted as well, less heavy with smoke, more touched by fresh air drifting through the open doorway. Repeated snowstorms shaped your days into careful routines. Digging out the entrance, rationing flour, reinforcing beams. Listening through the night, each task became part of a steady rhythm that carried you through. Now the rhythm changes. There will be repairs to make above ground, paths to reestablish, neighbours to visit and stories to exchange, letters to deliver at last. The dugout will remain, but it will no longer define the entirety of your world. Scholarly discussions about frontier endurance often emphasize adaptation over conquest. Settlers did not defeat winter. They adjusted to it. They used earth wisely conserved heat shared labour and waited for cycles to turn. You feel that truth settle quietly as you stand in the doorway once more. The prairie stretches outwards, no longer hidden. Snow lingers in shaded pockets, but the sky is wide and open. You step fully outside and close the dugout door gently behind you, not as an act of confinement, but as one of completion. The shelter served its purpose. It held firm beneath repeated storms. It absorbed weight and muffled wind, kept warmth near where the world felt distant and erased. You look across the land and recognize that what the earth taught you was not merely how to endure cold. It taught you patience, attention, the value of small rituals, the power of steady maintenance over dramatic gestures. The dugout remains behind you, solid and quiet. It will be there if another storm season demands its protection. For now, though, you walk forward into light. The wind brushes gently across exposed ground. The sky deepens toward blue. And beneath it all, you carry the memory of sleeping under layers of soil and snow, of listening through long nights, of carving paths that vanished and carving them again. Winter did not conquer you, it faced you. You pause one last time and glance back at the earthen doorway half hidden in the rise of land. It looks almost ordinary now. Then you turn toward open prairie, ready to let the season fade behind you. For a moment longer you stand between earth and sky, neither fully inside nor fully beyond. The dugout behind you still holds the faint scent of smoke and damp clay. The prairie before you breathes with early spring light. Let your shoulders loosen. Let the memory of weight above your head soften into something gentler. The storms have passed, the beams held, the walls endured. Inhale slowly. Feel how different the air is now. It carries space within it. Exhale just as slowly. Imagine the layers of snow that once pressed above you melting quietly into soil, becoming part of the ground that sheltered you. There is no rush now. No need to listen for creaks in the night or measure flour in careful handfuls. The season has turned, and with it the rhythm of your days. The dugout remains as a quiet witness to what you've learned. Patience, attention, the warmth of the small rituals in confined spaces. Above you the sky stretches open and calm, and as this long winter settles into memory, allow your thoughts to drift gently the way snow once drifted across the prairie. You're warm, you're safe, the earth has held you well. Now rest. Sweet dreams.